Aeschylus and Sophocles. And Aeschylus was the one who talked about the distillation of wisdom, drop by drop.
Yes. Yes, I put that wrong in the comments last week. Last week I said it was Euripides, but it was Aeschylus.
Aeschylus, yes. And he had I don't want to divert the discussion this week. That quote ended with something that really struck me. I looked it up, by the awful grace of God. And Kenneth Smith talks about the grace of God too. Yes. But that was the first time I saw it being classified as awful. What did that mean, I asked. So we'll talk about that another day.
Yeah. So for before you got on, Dave was asking what we were doing the last couple of weeks. And last week was an example of what I meant when I said we veer off sometimes to tackle an interesting subject. So last week we talked about ethics, basically. We talked about the framework for good and evil in nature, in God, and in humanity from the perspective of different worldviews and from different philosophers, and the things that they had to say about it that really were dramatically different, and how the medieval vision of good and evil is so dramatically different from the modern, which is so dramatically different from the Archaic Greek. We even talked about the transition from the Archaic Greek to the Classical Greek and how they disagreed with each other as they were transitioning from one to the other about their conception of human nature and good and evil.
Sounds interesting. I'm sorry to have missed it.
Well, it's up on YouTube.
Oh, they are?
Yeah. David Rowe always posts them on YouTube.
Okay, because I could have done with that when I was reviewing this. I should have.
Yeah, if you go to YouTube and you Google David Rowell, you'll find his posts. Every one of these sessions is up there. And that's part of our way of apologizing for choosing a time that's awkward for a lot of people.
Okay.
To make sure that people can.
What time is it there now?
So I'm 3 hours off from you because I'm Pacific Coast. So it's 2:07.
2:07?
Well, sorry, it's 2:07 your time. It's 11:07 my time.
Yeah.
I envision a day in the future when we will not do this anymore and we'll all be on the same time, and we'll just say, you know what, people get up at different times and that's the way it is. But we don't have to constantly do math to say what time is it.
Well, you could be in China. They're in one time zone.
Yeah, that's right.
However, the sun is not in the same time zone, but nonetheless.
Exactly.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Nice to see everyone.
Likewise.
How's everyone doing today?
Good. We're good.
Good.
We're good. Now that you and Richard are here, and Marianne, let's dive in. We're gonna at 1:30. Sharon's gonna drop off for a bit to go to a conference call, and then she'll come back. But we're diving in. Unless somebody brings up another fascinating topic that makes us veer off to left field. Our plan for this week, as it was for last week, is Myth, Soul, Earth, and we're going through it looking for things that a beginner would have trouble understanding if they hadn't read Kenneth Smith before, and the only thing that they'd read is the previous essay and the notes that we're adding. And so we're taking this opportunity to annotate with endnotes and to make notes about maybe things we might write little intros for. Because we're making a book, right? We're turning Kenneth's essays into a book. So
I did have one thing that when Sharon asked if people are good or evil, I started to think of race. And I was thinking that if you were Black in the South, there's like a no-brainer. And so I don't believe in situational ethics, but I started to believe it after thinking that.
Yeah.
So thank you for the question.
It's a great question.
So
can you elaborate more what you mean there, Marianne?
I was thinking of my life situation, which happened to be very protected Roman Catholic thing, and good and evil was that sense of purity. And so I think sometimes evil was around me, but it was more like a Dickens novel where the characters were very polite and ingratiating, but they would stab you in the back.
Those
And-
backstabbers.
but not too often. Most of the time people were good. And so I had this thing that people are basically good, but then I questioned myself. And so I don't quite have the certainty I used to have.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sharon.
So can I change? Can I be the first one to bring up a point from this myth, soul, and earth?
Sure.
It's the Procrustean bed. Page 1. Mind abstracted becomes a voyeur abstractively gratified, even when it forces nature into the Procrustean bed of uncontrollable laboratory conditions.
Yes.
Still, it is only abstracted that will be extorted from the evidence. That's quite a mouthful, actually.
It really is. It really is. So certainly we can introduce the Procrustean bed. You're right. We should tell the little story of Theseus and Procrustes. But what about even if you know what the Procrustean bed is, what about the rest of the sentence? Does it work?
Once I understood what the Procrustean bed was, the rest of the sentence fell into place.
Okay. Okay, that's good. Then yeah, we'll do that. Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. Anybody else have anything for this first page?
No.
When he
I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to ask, can you throw up a link in the chat again? It's no longer on the meetup page anymore. If anyone just has a link, they drop it in there. That'd be great.
Yeah, let me go grab it from an earlier week.
We missed
Sorry,
you,
Aaron.
Dave. We did miss you.
I was telling Richard, yeah, one week we had the power outage internet type thing, and then another week I just totally forgot.
You're in Texas?
I'm in Oregon.
Oregon, okay.
We had a pretty severe snowstorm up here, and we don't usually get anything, so.
Here's the link.
Can you tell me what page we're on? I just got
We're on page 1, Myth, Soul, and Earth, page 13.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go.
I was wondering, like when he refers to the age of myth, like, should that be kind of maybe? Is there a footnote or something explaining, kind of like the time, the region and time he's referring to specifically, or?
That's a great idea. Let's do that.
Where is that, Richard?
At the bottom of the page is a sentence that goes on to the next page.
Never again since the age of myth have human beings been so utterly at home in the world. Yes.
Now, the Procrustean bed, when I read that, the meaning of that, it kind of fitted into like corporate management. It's a scheme or pattern into which someone or something is arbitrarily forced.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. The traditional round peg into a square hole is the action of the human mind upon the world. We bend everything to fit our preconceptions. And that's our Procrustean bed.
So who was Procrusteus? I can't remember that.
Okay, let's do that. So this comes from the cycle of myths of Theseus. And Theseus was a Greek hero beloved by the Athenians. There were, Hercules was beloved by a number of other places because he was strong and he fought monsters. But the Athenians liked Theseus better because he was more about being clever and even striving to be wise. And so the story of Theseus begins that he was the son of the king of Athens. Athens is named after Athena, so it's the city of wisdom. Mm-hmm. But he was born to his mother in a village far away from Athens, a very parochial place. And she raised him up as best she could. Before he was born, Theseus's father took his birthright, a sword, and I forget what else, some artifacts under a giant boulder that was too big for a child to lift, and even too big for most adults to lift. But a strong adult could lift it because he knew his son would, be as strong as he was if he trained diligently. And so when Theseus came of age, he spent his whole life thinking, well, someday I'm going to be strong enough and I'm going to lift that boulder and I'm going to get the heirlooms my father left for me. And then I'm going to take the road to the city of wisdom. This was his whole story growing up that he was ready for. So when he comes of age and he's able to do it, he lifts the boulder, he gets the things, he hits the road. And then the whole point of this cycle of stories is that the road from the parochial place where he grew up to the city of wisdom is full of challenges that a human being has to overcome their own parochialism. The whole thing is a metaphor for growing up and becoming cosmopolitan and wiser. And so there's various villains along the road. So in the same way that Hercules had his labors where he had to fight different monsters, Theseus had his encounters along the road with different villains who at their different spots had different strategies for trying to waylay travelers and prevent them from getting where they're going. Procrustes was one of these villains. He had a hut. One of the most sacred rules in ancient Greece was hospitality. It was one of the only things that Zeus actually did as a thou shalt. He said you have to be hospitable to your guests. And Procrustes was a villain because he would pretend to be hospitable and invite people in to stay the night. But once they were there, after they were tired and ready to go to bed, he'd pounce upon them and he'd drag them to his bed, his guest bed. And his guest bed was a fixed size. And if the guest was too short, he'd stretch them on it until they died, like a rack. And if they were too tall, he'd cut parts off them until they fit the bed, and then they would die from bleeding to death. Either way, he's molesting them, to fit his fixed frame of reference. And of course, the end of the encounter with Procrustes is that Theseus puts him on his own bed and uses his own Procrustean bed against himself, and that's how he overcomes the native parochialism. You can if once you see the bed and once you see that you're doing this to the truth, once you see that you're warping everything, then you can hold that warpage accountable too. So this is like a metaphor for what Kenneth Smith talks about when he talks about dislocating the joint of the mind to turn it around to look back at itself so that it can be critical about itself as it is about the things outside of itself. This is how the Greeks tried to represent that idea, is with the bed of Procrustes, and the wise person is skeptical of the bed and treats it as something that has to be criticized. In other words, we criticize our own parochial assumptions and our belief systems. We don't treat them as the truth, but we treat them as a source of error and something that has to be fixed.
So let me ask, is he really criticizing the bed, or is he using the same tactics that the bed is in order to criticize it in a sense? In other words, because this leads to a question like, once you're in a system, such as a capitalist system, as an example, or a democratic system, whatever system it is,
right?
In order to win the argument, it almost seems to be like you can't win it from outside. You have to now remain playing within that game. And so therefore you have to use the same ideas that it produces in order to criticize it. So that in itself forces you into the system in order to defeat the system, right? So I mean, isn't that what capitalism in a sense forces us to do? And instead of like talking about empathy and all that, it's talking about, it actually is better for the economy if we do it this way.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like we're forced to justify it on the basis of what they've already predetermined. Is that actually breaking out the system? Or is that what we now might call deconstructing the system?
See, now you're doing a fascinating thing here, because you're getting right to some of the deeper layers of this myth that we normally gloss over. So let's look at those. There's a couple of things about this. One of them is that Procrustes in his mind was obeying the law of Zeus and being a good host. He thought it's not his fault that the guests don't fit the bed well. He's doing his very best to make them fit. And he thinks that that's being a good host. He tells himself, he rationalizes his behavior. And it's partially because he doesn't have any empathy. He's never been on the receiving end of what he's dishing out to others. And partially it's because of compartmentalization, the way that people can have contradictory ideas in their head at the same time, but as long as they never let them meet, then they never have to realize there's a contradiction. and they can just sort of unconsciously mode switch from I'm serving you tea, I'm giving you food, and then the next thing we know, I'm murdering you, but I've kept them separate in my head. I'm just putting you to bed is all I'm doing. I can tell myself that it's not part of the same thing, that they're not related to each other. So that's one thing, is that there's these strategies that go on in Procruste's mind to make it okay for him to do this. And this is what we all do when we look at the world and then we distort it as we store it so that we're warping it. We tell ourselves that we're being honest. And we tell ourselves that if someone asks us a question and instead of telling them the truth, we tell them what we believe, we say that we're being honest, when we haven't actually done the due diligence on our beliefs to see whether or not this is an accurate representation of the world, or good and evil, or whatever it is that we're trying to talk about. So there's this element of, have we critiqued ourselves? Have we criticized ourselves? That Procrustes isn't doing. And the reason that Theseus isn't caught unawares is that, his mom raised him with stories from the City of Wisdom. And so he walks into the situation that a lot of other people are blindsided by, and he immediately starts noticing the little subtle clues that things haven't been compared to each other. They haven't been reconciled with each other, and that this whole situation might be a trap. So that's part of it, but that doesn't get to the deeper thing you said. The deeper thing you said is the really interesting part, which is, isn't he using Procrustes' own system? Isn't that working within the system and being trapped within it? And can you really break out of it by doing that? So this is where you get into some of the more difficult parts of Hegel. Remember, Hegel criticized thesis, antithesis, synthesis because he said other people before him were just arbitrarily picking two things in conflict and creating a reconciliation of them. But what he wanted to do was the opposite of that, where he says the antithesis actually, you can't call it that because it actually develops from within the initial system. The system itself is unstable and incomplete and unsatisfactory. And the only way you can live in a system like that is to gradually, iteratively break out of it by using the resources available to you to criticize the thing that you're trapped within. And so he says, you go from the bud to the blossom to the fruit, instead of being, let's pit, Magneto against Professor X because it would be fun to watch them fight the way that Kant used to do. He's like, let's see the relationship between them. And what that talks about for us is that we're in a difficult position because we are thinking within the terms of the Procrustean bed that we're trapped in, but somehow we have to bring enough insights to it to realize that it's an unsatisfactory, incomplete, and not a good enough life, and figure out how to leverage the system against itself so that the bud develops into the blossom and we escape out of the thing that we're trapped in. Now, we're used to thinking of good and evil as opposites, and that good comes to defeat evil, like Hercules defeated the Nemean lion or the Hydra. And in that case, it would seem to be inexplicable that we could use the flawed resources that are available to us to defeat the flawed system that we're trapped in. But what Hegel says is that's the nature of life, that we have to escape the system that we're in using the resources we have, but pitting them against each other in a new way, right?
Could I continue to ask this? I'll make it a little bit more personal in this sense. I'll go back to what I said last week about the statement about empathy. I said, when one suffers, all living things suffers, immersed in the anonymous flesh of living substance. This is the locus of elemental empathy.
Yes.
My example would be like, you go out and there's a guy who's down and out. He looks very down and out, and he asks for money or whatever it is. That is a direct appeal on an empathetical level, okay? Now, you could say yes or you could say no, because you're generous or you're hard ass, or you could come up with some kind of like rationalization, or because rationalization and reason are actually intertwined, and you say, well, it's kind of like not my fault. I can't solve all the world's problems. We live in a capitalist system that's exploiting you, and then you in a sense give yourself some absolution by saying no, okay? But then you say, it's better if I attack the system itself by contributing, let's say, in this case, I'll make it personal, to like the Democratic Party so that we actually have a sense of trying to change the system, okay? So I actually did that. I gave quite a lot of money. As they say, you know, one said, have you given as much as you could? And I answered very honestly, no, not as much as I could, but as much as I'm willing to, okay? Now, I gave quite a bit of money, and now I'm saddled with a system like 80% of my email is like begging for money. Right? Begging for money, because I'm like a mark now, okay? And asking like, and then some of them will be nasty, you know, like, have we lost you, Phil? You know,
Right.
this and that. I mean, some
Don't
of it.
you care anymore, Phil?
Whatever it is. And then I'm saying like, okay, you haven't lost me, but on the other hand, you're becoming a nag because I can't bear the weight of the entire system. And now I'll bring in Antigone. Okay, I'll bring in Antigone. And I mentioned Antigone last time. The problem with Antigone is that she was too caught up in a divine system, and she needed to understand the world she lives in, a political system. Antigone was actually the correct heir to the throne.
Uh-huh.
She had fought the system in the right way. She could align her alignment of the divine understanding with the political understanding that's actually in the world. That was her flaw, okay?
Yeah.
Her flaw was not that she was not a good person, but she didn't understand that you also have to live in the world and deal with the mess that it is in. And
Yes.
so therefore, you're caught in the system in which the guy is asking for money, and you feel like you're a hard ass to turn away. But on the other hand, if you actually do something to change the system, it might be better. Now, it doesn't mean that I always turn away these people. Sometimes I break down. But on the other hand, I also realize that how many people could I help and the system would be the same. I mean, we're caught in this funny thing in which you're trying to fight the system, but it's so convoluted that in a sense, it's very, very difficult.
Yes.
That's all I'm saying, right? Because you have to live in the world of the divine as well as the world of actuality of existence.
That's right. Thank you, Phil. Richard and Marianne, I'm gonna let Sharon jump the line because she's about to drop off to her conference call for a sec, and I'll do you guys.
Can I just respond to that? I think when you see a man and he's begging, there are so many factors that contribute to his current state, personal choice and the system. And so if you think that you can impact the system and it will subsequently impact him, that thinking gets itself lost and is not very satisfying. So it's better off if you just give the guy $1 or a cup of coffee, if that's what he wants, because then you would have satisfied his need. And you can deal with the system in another end. Because the Democrats, no matter how good they are, you're still going to have poor people on the street because people make that choice. People make choice about their lives, right? And I see them and you talk to them, they don't want to live anyplace else. You know, or some guys, they go to jail and they come back and they said, Doc, I have 3 meals and room and board here. Okay, it's a weird way to think, but it's a choice they're making. So I hear you, Phil, about the system, but then there's always the personal choice of the people.
So Sharon, you don't believe in systemic homelessness?
Systemic what? Homelessness?
Homelessness? Do you believe in systemic homelessness?
Absolutely, I do. And
Right.
they're usually the mentally impaired. However, though,
or economically disadvantaged, right?
Yes.
That's a huge source of homelessness.
Well, those are tightly intertwined.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is when you impact one-on-one, think of the whole system in which they're in that one interaction. I don't think it's the outcome for you is positive. It's a boundary. It's boundaries again.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, so let's do Richard and then Marianne.
Yeah, just to couple comments, like, just a first quick aside, like, yeah, like hospitality, I guess, for those unaware, I guess one of the most famous Greek myths, or like kind of mythic retellings, like the Trojan War, was precipitated by a violation of this, fundamental hospitality, when Paris, who was one of the princes of Troy, takes away and kind of elopes basically with the wife of Agamemnon. It was Agamemnon's brother, I think, right? Who lost his wife Helen. Anyway, but and then that's what causes Agamemnon to basically rally, like all the forces of Greece against against Troy. But yeah, like responding to Phil and like kind of the Procrustean bed and like how that's such a a good metaphor for our economic system. It's like so many times, like you see pundits on our news today, it's like, yeah, like we shouldn't let all these people starve to death because it would be good for the economy if we didn't. It's always kind of framed in that way. Like when we have like these systemic failures and we're trying to kind of and failing in vain to try to like adjust for them, like now that like we're in this period of stress for that. The Procrustean bed is also really good, just like not even just in terms of just perceiving something and like just kind of like fitting it to our like our preconceptions. It's basic, like I see it so much like in the way we have to basically do this abstraction to collect metrics, and so much of our modern society is so metric driven. This kind of started so recently. Adam Curtis released his new documentary, "Can't Get You Out of My Head."
Oh, great! Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's on YouTube. I'm going to provide the links to it. So this new one is actually 6 episodes, like 8 hours.
Fantastic.
Some of his previous ones have been like three episodes, like 3 separate films together. But like this is like 6, and it explores and links together the various topics such as individualism, collectivism, conspiracy theories, national myths, American imperialism, and so on. So it's very much like goes to what we're talking about. But actually, like. Because of that, I wanted to kind of go back and watch some of his earlier works to kind of see his train of thought. And I've seen his stuff in the early 2000s, which were kind of more in response to 9/11. But I went back to his 2007 work, which is The Trap: What Happened to Our Dream of Freedom. And it talks a lot about kind of like how our modern economic system kind of reframes everything, kind of to this Procrustean bed, and so much of it became metric driven and how we model human behavior is very dehumanizing and simplistic. It's like this Homo economicus, like in some other circles, that's what it's called, like so that it would fit these equations of game theory, of John Nash's game theory.
So could you say again what is the name of this video or whatever it is?
So if you're recommending, like if you're interested in this filmmaker, I'd recommend going back and starting with 2007. The Trap. I'll post a link. Yeah,
you got to start with Century of Self. I think that's his.
Okay, yeah, I have seen that one too. Yeah, so I have seen that one, and then Power of Nightmares. But so the interesting in the Trap and these metrics, like anyone who's spent time in the corporate world or just like any modern job, like like or seeing government, like all these metrics, like like No Child Left Behind. It's so funny, like like sort of the center of the myth is like like we provide these metrics and it's quote objective, and then like we free people to go and be entrepreneurs and figure out how to meet these metrics. And it's really perverse, the things you see coming out of it. So like the National Health Service in UK, in order to like get waiting times down and whatnot, like so they just invented a new job in the emergency room. So people are still waiting a long time, but they just basically create a job for a non-medical personnel to basically greet you, and then that way you're signed into the system, and so that's how it cuts the waiting times down. Another kind of like really perverse like thing that comes out of this is that like the people will ask you like when your vacation, like when you're planning to be on vacation or out of town, and then when they know that, they'll purposely schedule your surgery time during those times that they know you have a conflict, and then so you'll be able to make it. So that way they can say like that way they can like say that, oh, okay, yeah, the surgery times are not increasing, and so another such things like that. So it's really kind of it's so pervading in our modern world. It's everywhere. It's
Yeah. Marianne and then Joseph. Thank you, Richard.
I'm thinking that a lot of what I wanted to say, Richard is saying, and I was thinking about Texas and how we think the status quo, like we think, okay, things will be okay if we just keep the status quo. But you look at Texas, they can't even keep the lights on. And if they do keep the lights on, it's $16,000. So I feel like when we're talking about the Procrustean bed, we never ask the question of who's, the pain, where's the pain, who's feeling the pain? And can we be there for the people that are feeling the pain? And when Kenneth moves to the next story about mythic reality and loving the earth, I go, that still doesn't resolve it. There's a lot of hurt out there. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Marianne. Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question, actually. I mean, just it's building off of what Richard was saying, and actually what we've been talking about is the idea that we're, the synthesis, antithesis, like they're just pitting two ideas against one another. Is that essentially what metrics are doing? Like they are just pitting a couple of ideas against each other. And the worst part about it is they become dogma, and that's where the system, then you have to figure out how to get outside that dogma, so to speak. Exactly. So is that essentially the same thing? If you're applying it to a corporate or even government or whatever world, and that's what Hegel's warning us against.
That's exactly right. This is Hegel and Heraclitus's warning that systematized, intellectualized, rationalized, mechanicalized systems have this appeal because they feel rigorous and complete. Like somebody has really worked to make this coherent. But the problem is that coherency cloaks an incoherency that's at its foundation. And the incoherency is the arbitrariness of the abstractions that have been selected. It's easy when you're completely bought into a rigorous system of intellect to forget that any abstraction inherently has extracted a few details out of the whole. And it is making a claim that it prefers that you not notice or think about too much. And the claim is that it has picked the right details to represent the whole. This is that term synecdoche, right? The part that stands for the whole. This is the basis of all metaphor and simile, and it's the basis of all intellectual rationalized systems. And as Phil would be the first to tell us, what distinguishes an artist from a non-artist is are you actually doing justice to the act of selection so that the metaphors that you're picking are potent and moving and profound? Or are you just sort of mechanically, systematically going through the motions of abstraction such that you aren't being responsible for whether the resulting work of art is actually art or whether it's something dehumanizing like, a system of metrics? There's a question here, and it's the most potent ethical question when evaluating these things. But systems of intellect encourage us not to think about that question. They try to make it seem like they are objective and inevitable and really unquestionable, so don't think about it. And that's where the real violence is done, is in that lacuna, that omission, that act of what Kenneth Smith calls nescience. One of the most profound aspects of culture is what are the things you learn not to think. The blind spots, and that they're almost always a map of the true architecture of power in the system that you belong to. It's the things that we don't think about, the things we don't talk about, and it's not an accident, because otherwise the system of power would be dismantled immediately. If we were just all having a straight up conversation about the inherent, injustice of how things work, and we could see exactly what the causes were and what we would have to do to stop them, then we would just reach out and stop them. It's our confusion that keeps us unable to act, and our uncertainty. And the confusion and uncertainty are bred by not even letting a confusing discussion happen. So that when you think it, you're in isolation. You're by yourself looking at a big problem, thinking about this thing, feeling all alone, and having none of the words or terms or concepts necessary to turn it into a strategy that you could act upon. So there's this dismantling of the process of praxis, of thought leading to action, that's built right into nescience. This is why you see in Manufacturing Consent, Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky say one of the keys to maintaining a false consciousness is that you frame in what's allowed to be talked about. And you don't ever talk about the things outside of the frame. You use endless tricks to make that stuff, any attempt to talk about those things sort of erode or fall apart or get weak. But within the frame, you encourage lively and intense debate. And it makes everybody feel free because they're like, see, I can choose any of the available choices. And it makes you think that, in fact, there aren't any other choices. Even if
very similar to what we do in our political system, right?
Exactly.
So they
we
define
encourage
the
a very
boundaries.
lively debate. Yep, within those boundaries.
Well, not only that, but even if you're a creative person, the problem is that the system could get you to into a perverse creativity. A very fundamental, a very elemental example of this was I was watching basketball last night, and of course they now have a rule that in order to protect the shooter, you have to give them space to land. Okay, that's a good rule. Okay, but then if you are creative in a minor sense, then you play that system, and as the shooter, you kind of jump into the guy and kick your feet out slightly, so he, in a sense, fouls you, right? So that is like, okay, so you create all these little avenues in which you could be creative within the system, but it's perverted not outside the system, but it seems like within the system, there's so many little maneuvers you could do to pervert it that it end up you're chasing the system itself. And I think you become trapped, even as a you think, well, I'm creative, I've invented something, right?
Yes.
Instead of like, no, you should invent something else. That's why you need to change the system, because like in basketball, for instance, when they change the system to where the 3-point is counts, it used to be you could always shoot at that point, but you get 2 points. And it took a while when they have the 3 points, and finally somebody like Steph Curry comes along, we could actually make this a steady game and completely change what the thing is. That is a basic change in the rules, which is different from, let's say, jumping into a guy so you get a foul, you get 3 shots.
Right.
Right. So in some sense, like even it subverts even creativity, because it turns creativity into an internal struggle rather than an external struggle.
Right. And the thing that you talked about earlier, I'll come to you in just a second, Joseph and Dave. The thing that you talked about earlier about working within the system, are you being forced to think using the terms of the system? There's so much profundity to that, because modernism is as much medievalism as it is whatever's coming next, right? It's got a foot in both worlds. And it's hard for us, we don't know what the future looks like, so it's hard for us to see the seeds of the future that are present in what we have, what's going to be a going concern that we can grow off of. But it's equally hard because modernism prides itself on having escaped the Dark Age and being an age of objective enlightenment. It's hard for us to see how medieval our thinking still is, and how much we are still actually, we didn't, the revolution that broke modernism away from the medieval era was also a continuation of medievalism. It shed some things, but other things continued. That aspect of thesis antithesis, which is why Hegel doesn't like the terms, but that aspect in which the opposition grows from within the system that exists now is hard for us to fully grok, because the modernist myth is that that's not what happened. The modernist myth is that we stood up for the first time against superstition and corruption, and we said, no more, we're going to rule ourselves and we're going to be free, right? We argued that we were a transcendental eruption of a new freedom into the world, and completely liberated ourselves from what came before. And that belief, which we thought of as anti-medieval, is really just the salvation theology, right? We will be saved from the crimes and sins of this world by being translated into a perfect new world somewhere else through an act of teleportation You know, that salvation is basically arguing a break of causality, and that you can be in a new form that is unrelated to the previous form. There's a mechanical, arbitrary, transcendental aspect to salvation theology that is present in the modernist myth that we saved ourselves from the medieval era by standing up and writing constitutions and having revolutions. And so there is a tendency in us to think that the way you escape bad things is through teleporting out of your current circumstances, through an act of salvation, through an act of dislocation and eruption, breaking of history. And it means that we are, in a way that we really can't perceive, we are really ill-suited to understand the way in which actual revolutions have to act from within the system that you're already in, working against the forces that already have you in their grip, using the resources that you already have, but seeing them in a new way, understanding them in a new way, and realizing there's more potential there that we don't routinely get involved in. It's hard for us to see that. And so it's why when we read Hegel's description of thesis, antithesis, synthesis as being bud, blossom, fruit, it's really hard for us to reconcile the two, because our liberation kind of concept of how you change and how opposition arises and where freedom comes from, it doesn't actually fit the natural world of bud, blossom, fruit at all. So we struggle with this, and it's natural that we struggle because this is our nature as moderns. I think Joseph, and then, I don't know who put their hands up next, but I know Joseph's next.
I just had a quick question. I mean, based on what you were just saying, is that, and I have a lot of thoughts that are going through my head, even how to change the system, how to leverage the system, and what to, how change actually occurs. But what's the modernists' answer to chaos? Like, so how do they engage with the unknown? Because it seems like they're working within a frame and just standing up against that frame, and therefore this is the way, like, they work within the current constructs of the system. So they aren't necessarily dealing with an unknown. They're just standing up against something. Is that clear?
Yeah.
In a way?
Yeah.
I mean, so how does a modernist stand up to, or engage with the unknown or chaos in general?
Could I say something about that in an oblique way? When I was younger, I used to actually quite enjoy driving across the country at night, because unlike driving at the day in which I could see the mountains, I could see this and that, which has got its own beauty. I'm not saying anything against that. But at night, it just seemed like there's all this hazy mystery in which you always confronting, and because your headlights will only go 30 feet ahead of you, right? And that you are limited, and you understand how limited your perspective is. And then there's all this mystery, and then you have to get used to the point, like, that's okay. I have to trust within myself to navigate that. Now, as I get older, I can't do that anymore because it's harder for me to do it. So maybe there's a natural tendency as you get older, you become more conservative. I don't know what it is. But I used to remember enjoying that moment, because in a sense, that moment was truly liberating, because I have to accept the ambiguity and the uncertainty and the darkness out there. Now, if it was like only 2 feet in front of me, then I probably would freak out, right? But if it's 30 feet, like, okay, I could sort of like make some adjustments, okay, all that. Now, it's also not the same as driving. Imagine if I was backing all the way, even in the daylight, all the way back. It's also not driving backwards, in which I only saw like what's behind me, because that's what it really is. I'm just driving with the rear view mirror, and it's like, and I know like what's in front of me or what's behind me now is like completely different. And I often thought, like, how would it be if I drove across the country only using my rear view mirror?
Yeah.
That's what we're caught in, right?
Right.
As a human being, you're always caught in as much as you know history itself, you're always still driving in a rear view mirror. That's different from looking at the front shield, and only 30 feet, and there's darkness, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's Kierkegaard, right? Life can only be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. It's when we think about the modernist concept of order and chaos, right, which law and order versus criminality, right, chaos is the source of criminality, right? In the modernist conception, we need hard people who follow rules and wield violence to beat back the chaos with their clubs and their tasers and their guns, and to lock up the chaos in orderly places, because if they don't, everything will fall apart. That's like one of the premises of the modern order that we don't think about, but we feel it a lot. And it's used to manipulate us in PR and advertising and political campaigns. And so there is this concept that order is the opposite of chaos, and that the only way that a meaningful life is possible is if order is brutally imposed to hold the chaos at bay, and that's what freedom is. That creates the space for freedom for the law-abiding civilians who, know their place and don't rock the boat. But one of the things that you discover when you work on complex systems is that mechanical systems of order like that, they sort of are imposing a totalitarian worldview, a mechanizing worldview that says if we just script everything enough and everybody rigorously, robotically follows the script, then everything will be okay. But if we let things just happen, then that is a source of chaos. And of course, people would immediately rush to crime and sin, and everything would fall apart. And so we must be rigidly controlled. The whole toxic masculinity culture that's inculcated in men, where they're not allowed to express any feelings for fear something might come out that makes them bad or weak or gay or whatever they're terrified of. That rigid, marching in lockstep. If I'm just rigid enough, then we can all hold it together and it won't collapse. This is an uncomfortably revealing aspect of what we actually think we're doing when we try to uphold modernist systems of order over chaos. When you look at complex systems, what you discover is that form of order is not sustainable, and it can't manage extreme complexity. And by extreme complexity, I mean even the basic complexity that the natural world has no problem whatsoever organizing, but that when we try to rise to that level, we get too rigid, too scripted, too mechanical, not responsive enough to the real world, and our things fall apart. I think about the way that when they were doing, you thought about the promise of the space shuttle. What if instead of, one-shot rockets, we could fly up, do what we needed to do, and fly back like a spaceship over and over? It seemed like a reasonable thing to expect, right? But what they discovered is that it fell apart every time they ran it. I mean, enormous numbers of the tiles came off, the heat tiles without which it would collapse. All kinds of screws came loose. I mean, the shaking it goes through as it comes through the atmosphere. It basically, even though it came back intact, the mechanical order that we were basing all of our machinery upon couldn't actually withstand the organic forces of the atmosphere, the turbulence, the heat, and so forth that it had to pass through each way. And yet, we really couldn't accept the logical conclusion, which is that these mechanizing systems of order are really ill-suited to deal with the complex organic nature of the cosmos. So if you look at Christopher Alexander's work on architecture, and if you look at Ted O'Neill's work on medical informatics, what you start to see is that there is an other form of order that can be used to organize things that the modernist totalitarian order calls chaos, but isn't chaos at all. It's how the natural world organizes itself. And in fact, it's the only way to achieve high levels of complexity, which is why the natural world uses it. Nothing we've ever done is as complex as what Mother Nature does automatically. And that it's sustainable and can handle scales that the mechanizing order of the modern world can't handle. So from a modernist perspective, organic order is chaos. But from an organic perspective, the totalitarianizing, mechanizing order is chaos because it can't sustain itself. It collapses in the face of the natural complexity that we deal with in the ordinary world. So Joseph, you're asking one of those Heraclitean deep questions here that gets right to the core of the modernist worldview and how we misconceive the universe and how we've organized ourselves. It's brilliant.
And I see exactly where the metrics, become the problem. And, let's just talk about the metrics of you know, your own sexuality. This is what we need, and this is the metric of being good or bad. Like, this is the dogma that runs, you know, kind of the system itself. So therefore, this is what we're making. This is our order that we're instilling on the world, and that order is actually totalitarian in its own right. Now, it makes complete sense, and then it also makes complete sense on how it's starting to become clear to me how the system can change too, and it, you know, and then basically organically change.
Yeah, you know, part of the structure of organic order is what Heraclitus pointed out, that there are deep forces at work, deep principles that are creative, that generate organic order, and that they are hard to pin down and explain in binary terms. So as long as you're working within a system that insists upon the excluded middle, like these systematizing approaches that we have do, they want to say that they are good and absolutely everything else is bad.
Right.
And when they say absolutely everything else, they're including the things within themselves that give them life and make them possible as being bad. But they don't know that that's what they're saying. It just doesn't fit within their Procrustean bed, the rigidity of the system they're using to do the measurements. And it's part of why, to get to Phil's earlier question about Theseus and the Procrustean bed and breaking out using the system that you're in, when you're in a mechanizing system like that, you can't see it for what it is, because you're using the mechanizing schema to try to analyze the mechanical system. And that's the one area that it is properly prepared for. As long as you think in its own terms, it seems complete and inevitable. It's just when you compare it to the real world that it starts to fall apart. And so what you need in order to grow a new system, a new culture out of such a rigid order, is you need some kind of infusion of organic wisdom that allows you to reinterpret the system you're already in, to see the forces at work in it that are invisible from within its own terms, but that are actually its beating heart that make it possible. And it's at that level that you find the seeds that are going to grow into something new, not in the sterile schema that it has made for itself. And it's why these systems are so self-blind, because they're thinking exactly in the terms that prevent them from being able to understand how they actually work, right? They've abstracted even from themselves. And this is the stuff Hegel gets at over and over and over about Verstand, that you get so abstracted that you're not only abstracted from the world, but you're abstracted from your own feelings and even from your own thoughts. You only understand them in an abstract way. And it creates this schema of error that seems complete and self-enclosing that you're trapped within. And it's why what Theseus was able to do in the hut of Procrustes that none of the other guests were able to do is Theseus had grown up with the stories his mother told him about the city of wisdom, the little parables, the little insights, the little drops of organic insight that allowed him to look at the situation so many others had died in and see it in a new way and do something different from what any of them had done. And thus he was able to break the system and stop it and make it not happen anymore. And the road became safer and a better place to live and a better place to travel as a result.
But don't that run into another problem in this sense? In other words, it seems to me that almost this need for a system seems almost to be part of the human mind. Expect the human mind to break out of it. It almost seems to be a contradiction. And that leads me back to the myth of the Garden of Eden, right? Do anything you want, just don't eat this apple. Don't eat this apple. And but God knew. I mean, God's not ignorant. God knew this was a setup.
Yes.
God knew that he created the mind, and the mind will want to eat the apple. And then God blamed him for eating the apple, or blame her and him for eating the apple. And then he's the guy that's pulling the strings. Like, how on earth are you supposed to be able to rebel against God when he mandates that you will become this systematic mind that other animals don't have? I mean, how?
Well, Phil, as potent as that is, I think it's too potent for today's conversation. We'll have to come back to God and the apple. I want to catch up on the hands that have been up. Dave just put his hand down, but would you like to go, Dave?
Those others were ahead of me, well ahead of me.
Okay, Richard, then Marianne, then Dave.
Oh yeah, just a quick response to, or first a quick response to Phil's Apple thing. It's like, I think like psychologists. No, I'm not going to take that down a huge rabbit hole. No, but like no, like more pertinently, like it's like just basically just drawing someone's attention to someone, I think is so powerful in our modern society today. It's like, and even worse, it's like if you want something to get stuck in someone's head, tell them to forget it, or like ask them to forget something, and then like their mind will be and like will like uncontrollably be kind of drawn towards it. But kind of more along like kind of what you were talking earlier, kind of a thread like of, like so much of our modern system is kind of like is holding over from kind of medieval, right? Like, so, like within the cities, you kind of had like Martin Luther, and then like you had like the Enlightenment and David Hume liberalism, and then the Revolution. Like, I think sort of like a good way to kind of understand where we are is that like, like at the same time in the medieval times, we had a feudal kind of economic system for many people like in the cities. But like for the masses of our population right now, like our economic system resembles a neo-feudal system. And so it's really interesting, like in Adam Curtis's 2007 The Trap documentary, and that like sort of this promise of like economic freedom and destroying the old class hierarchies and structures. The paradox is that it's led to like even like a further ossifying of class boundaries, like worsening inequality and like reduced social mobility, like than any other time in our modern history. And what's worse is like our modern is this neo-feudal system. Like, I would imagine that like, in the old days, like if you were like a serf, you would kind of know you're a serf, and you would sort of like, you would know what the deal is. But right now it's basically cloaked like in this anti-myth, like the like our your precarious employment situation. It's being cloaked in this thing of like being your own boss and like your gig economy and the side hustle culture, and you have all this freedom to, like make yourself what you are. And if you fail, it's your fault.
Yes. Yes, there's that. I can't remember who was the person who said that the problem with trying to achieve any kind of class consciousness in the United States is that nobody thinks they're poor. They all think they're temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And, they're still aspiring. Any moment now, they're going to win the lottery or something, and so they want all those tax breaks for millionaires so that they can enjoy them once they're rich, which will be, tomorrow, maybe next week, any day now. And I think it's a gross oversimplification, but you can also see it at work in millions of Americans who think that way, that they really do identify with having lots and lots of money, even though they never have and never will.
Right. I mean, like this is very much personified in the 2008 election, with John McCain and like his elevating of like Joe the plumber, right? Like railing against like these taxes and whatnot, but where it totally doesn't apply to a situation at all.
That's right. Marianne, go ahead.
I have a lot of random thoughts because I've been holding them on.
You have.
And when Rick was talking about salvation theories, salvation, can't remember exactly how you said it. I was thinking of the golden trump, and I was thinking, here's salvation theory. And then the golden trump is pointing down back into the earth. And it's like the materialism, and I wanted to say paganism, but I would be insulting paganism. So it feels more like compost. And then somebody was asking about chaos theory, and I read one book that tried to describe chaos theory as a visual element using a river. And it was the turbulence in the river that was the thing. And then I started thinking, oh, QAnon is like our turbulence. We are already in chaos theory. We are here. And when Phil was talking about, driving backwards, I was thinking of a posteriori, and I've been making a joke that it describes Trump.
Yes.
So I've been having fun with that. And also, when Phil was talking about the apple, I was remembering my co-grandma. She said that Curious George, my grandson, should not read Curious George because it would lead him into bad things. And really, curiosity, I think, is one of the great things. So I stored all that in.
Thank you, Marianne. You held on to a great deal there. Let's do Dave and then James.
Yeah, I was just going to say a couple things, and they're a little stale now, but when we were talking about revolution and the idea of revolution, whether it's possible within a system or whether you need to go outside of the system, I agree that there is an organic change that can be possible. I think the seed is sown as soon as the system is created. The seeds are sown for its inevitable destruction or evolution, however you want to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, when it comes to politics, I mean, just look at, Ralph Nader, to get seatbelts in cars, automobiles, you had to work tirelessly for years and years and years, subject to corporate espionage. I mean, they went through the guy's trash. They tried to do everything they could. And it took so long to put a seatbelt in an automobile, even though all of the data was overwhelmingly in favor of that from a safety perspective, that I would argue we really have to go outside of the system. And this is where paradigm shifts come into play. And I understand, synthesis, antithesis, and, how that works. But I think there's a key shortcoming in all of this revolution talk. And I'm going to post a text here by Alexander Berkman. I read this. This is from the turn of the century. It's about anarchism and the real meaning of anarchism. It has nothing to do with violence or chaos at all. I would encourage everyone to read it. It's very, very readable, eminently readable. You could probably read it in about a week. And one of the key points he makes is that if you're going to have a revolution, you need to be prepared to take over the system and run it for a period of time through the transition to your next system. And I see that element lacking in all of this political discourse and all of these protests. No one is willing to take over the system. There's nothing there. So those movements are doomed to fail. And I would say they may have even been fomented by the system itself to further support some of its own totalitarian goals. I mean, just look at the crackdown. Now we're moving towards domestic terrorism. This is a tool of the system in my view. This is not doing anything to damage the system at all. In fact, I think the system is encouraging this type of divide and conquer. We have people who should be holding hands together against the elite and people who are disenfranchising the 99%. Instead, they're yelling at each other because people are playing the race card and whipping everyone up into a fervor. So I would really I am not optimistic that change can happen within the system on the scale that we need it to happen. I think the system will do everything it can to preserve itself, and that in and of itself sows the seeds of its own destruction. And just another example from economics. I mean, the more tightly we try to control the economic system through our central bank, the more anti-fragile it becomes, the more severe the dislocations become over time. And we're seeing that in financial markets now, to the point where the central bank cannot step away at all because the whole system would collapse. Mm-hmm. I don't know if many people are familiar with the term that is used by the Federal Reserve itself. It's called financial repression. We are in a regime of financial repression. That is what they themselves refer to this regime, with interest rates being so low. So, just a couple things for people to think about, and I would encourage people to take a look at that writing from Alexander Berkman as far as revolution goes. It makes a ton of absolutely fantastic points that are very relevant for today's society.
Thank you, Dave. James, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to respond to notion of the idea of the fall, the Christian myth of the fall, and that are we living through certain myths in the modern times with our scientific theories of the Big Bang, singularity that precipitated the Big Bang? Isn't that a kind of a myth of a story of a fall, that the universe began, with this kind of explosion that, it created all these particles, and then we're just kind of one of these particles that happened to have life, but it's really we're part of that fallen story. And even quantum mechanics, can be a kind of story of a fall, because it's based on the notion of symmetry, and then collapse that would be a kind of fall. And this is like, I got this from Zizek, and that's how he kind of plays with the Christian myth of the fall. And so this kind of relates to what Kenneth Smith is saying about myths and so forth, right? But it's the kind of myths that we're living through in the modern times is really being told by science, right?
So,
and
yeah.
they're the dominant spokespeople for that kind of mythology.
Well, what's interesting about it is that the deal that science struck in the Middle Ages to be allowed to survive was that they would steer clear of questions of meaning and good and evil and ethics, and they would leave that to the church, and they would just teach you how to make buildings that didn't fall down and how to shoot cannonballs that land on the ship that you wanted to hit, and that by splitting the realm of knowledge into the ethical and the practical, science would be allowed to pursue the practical without being burned at the stake, and religion would be left in charge of the ethical. This was the devil's bargain that science grew out of. And it's been interesting in recent centuries to watch science now that we're post the modern revolution and we're in the modernist era where the church is no longer in charge of everything. It's interesting to watch. You see it in medicine. Sharon's talked about it before, to see the sort of beginnings, very belated. I mean, it's sort of shocking how many centuries it's been, but the beginnings of some serious attempts to talk about ethics, and not just pragmatism, to say that ethics have to be part of the picture, because the pragmatism breaks down in certain situations, like end of life situations. What is the point of doing all these machines if they're not actually conscious and enjoying a life and never going to recover? And medicine has had to deal with it because they've been pointed right at life and death questions. But a lot of other aspects of science, especially where they've got corporate funding, have been insulated enough from ethical repercussions that they're still really focused on pragmatism. And can you make something that's patentable or profitable for the funders, so that they'll give you next year's funding to continue your research. So there's a way in which science sort of dabbles a little bit in some areas with myth, but largely it's steering as clear of myth as it can. And because it's just this leftover momentum out of the Middle Ages. And what we're being offered instead, in a lot of cases, is an anti-myth, in which we're given a story that has no particular ethical or human dimension to it, that doesn't create a larger worldview. It's just a little piece that we can use for something. And an example of that is if you compare and contrast the Big Bang with the fall from Eden. The fall from Eden is all about ethics. It's all about right and wrong, and whether people are good or bad, and whether we can achieve a better world, whether we maybe had a better world but we screwed it up, and can we get back? And there's all this kind of deep, potent, meaningful stuff in it. When you contrast that with the Big Bang, you find that science understandably has nothing to say about what happened before the Big Bang. You will find occasional scientists speculating about it, but the evidence doesn't take us any further, right? It's just trying to explain where all the material and momentum and mass and energy came from. And it doesn't actually posit any ethical perspective about why it happened, whether it was a punishment or a reward, whether it had anything to do with human beings, what's our relationship to it, were things good beforehand, is it even possible to conceive of a beforehand, if time started with the Big Bang? It's like most of the major mythic elements that would make people feel at home in that story are evacuated from it.
Who was it that said scientists say just give us one miracle and then we'll take care of the rest? The miracle being the Big Bang, right? Implying that it's sort of a bankrupt philosophy because they can't go back to the beginning, right? They have to take a miracle and then everything follows from that. I would only point out that the real quantum scientists, I think, do re-enter the mythical area. I'm thinking of people like Carl Sagan, Richard Feynman. They all really understood the importance of myth, because once you get to the quantum level, it's so crazy that you have to go there.
Yeah, popularizers of science in particular tend to find that the only way they can get people to remember the scientific principles is to tell the story and create some kind of a framework for it. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to comment on Dave's earlier comment about not trusting this system because you have to go outside of it. I wonder whether in the modern context, whether that's even possible in this sense. Unless we have developed a system which can truly correct itself by allowing itself to evolve higher and higher or further and further, then we are left with a quandary that, in a sense, it's always trapped within the system because the system cannot really truly criticize itself. Then you have to have an outside. Now, the advantage that in the sense that the late Roman period had was that there was hordes and hordes of people coming out of Central Asia that somehow is disrupting the system that they built, okay? And that in a sense, in a contemporary world, the problem is that we have such a totalizing structure that believes in capitalism. I wonder whether there is any external force outside of the fact that we will actually destroy the entire environment, in which that becomes an external force. Are we really putting in a position in which we will actually destroy ourselves or come close to destroying ourselves before we realize, oh, you know what? The system is not working, right? I mean, because if you expect what we mean by outside the system, you say, well, maybe China will be a new system that come and compete and show us whatever. Not only do I not believe that, but China is wrapped up in the capitalist system as strongly, maybe more strongly than even we are. So I wonder whether there actually is a force within the world itself, because it's a one world thing. There's no longer outside the world unless it really truly is outside the world.
And my response is that perhaps that perspective is the one that's trapped inside the system, and that the actual perspective that knows that we can jump to different paradigms like we have, over millennia is the real myth. Like, for example, to say that the system is so totally encompassing that we'll never be able to really get outside of it, I think is itself a product of the system. That's what it wants you to believe. Wants you to believe that it's impossible. This is the best we've got. You hear it all the time with critics of capitalism. And by the way, 10 years ago, if you criticize capitalism, someone could punch you in the face. Now, if you criticize capitalism, it's almost like a cliche. So we are making a lot of progress, I think, that goes unrecorded. And just look at renewable energy, oil trading below zero. Things are happening that we don't really appreciate and also do not get a lot of press, because the system knows that if it popularizes these alternatives, people will flock to them, and that will hasten its downfall. So I think that the real myth is that we constantly, or the truth, I don't know what I want to say there, but hopefully that made a little bit of sense. The system wants you to think that you are trapped inside of it and that it is all encompassing. But the truth is that as soon as the system came into being, I would agree with Kenneth Smith, the seeds for its own destruction were present, and that we will evolve, like necessarily, one way or the other. We will evolve into a different system, as we always have. Will it be enjoyable for us? That's open to debate, right? Will it be smooth and seamless, or will it be difficult and challenging? That's something where we have a say, I think. But there's no doubt that we will evolve, right? I mean, if we destroy the planet, that's an evolution.
Thank you, Dave. Sharon, go ahead.
I got a question. This is just for orientation. Are we still on Procrustean bed? Where did we go?
Yeah.
What page are we?
We are still on the Procrustean bed.
I think we're just talking to each other.
No, this really is all an explication of the Procrustean bed. It's one of the signs that you're dealing with a real myth. When you deal with a real myth, it doesn't have a bottom. You can dig and dig and dig, and it just gets deeper and more profound the more you get into it.
Isn't there a saying that you make the bed, now you sleep in it?
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, can I just say the way you explained it, Rick, and what Kenneth Smith had to say is on point, right? The Procrustean bed of controllable laboratory conditions, still it is only abstractor that will be extorted from evidence, quantitative data, and geometric profile of concordance. So it doesn't matter what exists. We try to believe or act on the contrary.
Right.
That's what I think, that's a myth, and he was using the Procrustean bed to make this example.
Yes. And this is where Dave's comments about the nature of revolution come right into play here with the Procrustean bed, because what you see is when we talk about the system, we have to understand there's at least two systems going on. There's the formalized schema that we're living according to, that we believe we're in, right? That all our laws and rules and all of our force and coercion are built around, and our conceptions about what's possible and where we can go. But at the same time, we're not actually inhabiting that imaginary abstract world of our laws and schemas. We're actually inhabiting the natural world. And it's got its own powers and forces that are more potent than the things that we're trying to bring to bear through our abstract schema. So we have a problem in that we're sleepwalking through our natural lives. And the dream we're having is this abstracted, intellectualized life. So when we talk about, when we revolt against the system, does it require us to bring in ingredients from outside the system? The truth is, the actual natural circumstances we're inhabiting are already outside of the intellectualized schema that we think we're inside of. And that's why, part of what goes on when you break into a new paradigm is that you are breaking free of the dream, the intellectualized dream you're having. You're finding elements of your actual circumstances and injecting them into the dream to create a new vision of the reality that you're in. And so from the perspective of someone who thinks entirely in terms of the abstract schema, it seems like he's inhabiting a new system. But what he's actually doing is he's come better into accordance with the true natural system that always was there underlying the artificial schema that he was living according to. This is that two worlds problem that all Homo sapiens have. There's the natural world, and then there's our idea of the natural world that we make decisions according to.
I would say separate from the natural world, which is now imposing both limits and feedback in terms of our actions. The system itself, has it's facing its public facing narrative, but then there's also the kind of the ways in the way it works and asserts power, which are kind of more hidden underneath.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, even within the system, even within the mechanizing system itself, you see one thing, but then how things actually operate. This can start to sound like kind of QAnon, but I mean, I'm more referring just the way lobbying works, the way kind of agendas are set at Davos and whatnot. I guess that's specifically what I'm referring to. Right?
Yeah. Well, I'll call on you just a sec, Sharon. It's entirely in keeping with what you're saying and with what Dave's saying, that part of the way that modernism works is by directly manipulating the schema that we have, the intellectual schema. So if the growth of the PR industry starting in the 20th century was based on the recognition that it's useful if you create two artificial systems not one. And one of them is the actual artificial system we're living according to. And the other is the artificial system that sells better and that people would prefer to think of themselves in. So you tell them they're in this one while you actually impose the second one. But of course, the problem that the PR people have is that they forget that meanwhile they're inside of a third one, which is the actual natural one, which is not necessarily obedient to either of those two schemas. So we play these games trying to deceive each other and govern according to withholding information, while at the same time we ourselves are missing a whole bunch of the information we actually need. Even the cleverest, schemiest, most conspiratorial of us, most powerful of us are operating under a false consciousness. The fact that we can point at other people and say, haha, but their consciousness is even more false because I lied to them and they believed it. We tell ourselves that that puts us closer to the truth, but it doesn't. It just puts them in a different lie than the one we're in. Sharon, then Marianne, then James.
So if you flip the page, and I think I kind of missed a little bit in the middle here, but on page 14, Nietzsche captured the ethos of this subliminal harmony in his exhortation to remain true to the meaning of the earth, to feed the Dionysian roots of our underlife. Does that dovetail with anything that we're saying?
That aligns with everything we're saying. Yes, that's how Nietzsche says what I just said.
Oh.
He says the earth is nature. The earth is the actual circumstances we live according to. Nietzsche, he posits the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, where the Apollonian is what we think intelligence and education are. We think that's wisdom, that we are educated and that we create these schemas of order. But the problem with Apollo is that he overestimates the power of the conscious mind and underestimates the power of the unconscious mind. But the actual natural circumstances we live according to, have more authority over us than the ideas we have about ourselves. And as a result, you find in Nietzsche, he writes over and over about the Dionysian, where he says, if we actually want to be wise in the Greek sense, if we want to have a better sense of our true circumstances and be able to apply them to make better decisions, then we need to balance Apollo against Dionysus and use them both. And this is his way of sort of representing the Gnosis Begriff, Dionysian side that's more in touch with reality and the unconscious and emotion, as well as the Apollonian Verstand side that's more intellectualizing and schematizing. Marianne, then Phil, then James.
I have a couple of thoughts. So I think that when we talk revolution, the truth is that when things collapse or disappear, we really will only pick up what ideas are on the table at that moment. And it reminds me of fractal design. And we really can't get out of the biology of, even in our consciousness, of creating a system that's totally 100% outside. So the revolution really is kind of a revolution, and to me, understanding our organic nature. And my other thought, what Dionysius roots of our underlife, really makes me think that that kind of statement where the Dionysius, and I'm very illiterate on this subject, is really that sense of allowing ourselves to feel pleasure in this lifetime, as opposed to in another lifetime when we go out there. And it's an underlife. But I think that really the moderns, we are so Dionysian in what we want. We want to get it right now.
Yes.
So it's here.
Yeah, that the emotional unconscious side is actually hooked up to the engine of the economy and supposedly drives everything. And yet at the same time, we encourage people to think of themselves in an Apollonian way, where they sort of get distanced from their feelings and distanced from their dreams. And so we've sort of created this unconscious engine for things that we don't understand very well, let alone where it's going. And you see this with ultra intellectuals of the kind that I was when I was young, where you have made a bunch of decisions about yourself and you've learned a bunch of things and you think that's who you are. And it cuts you off from listening and paying attention to what do I not know about that might be acting in myself. You talked about, there's a Heraclitus quote. It's one of my favorites and almost nobody quotes it. That's relevant to what you said. he has one where he says, even Homer, wisest of the Greeks, is ignorant, because he was fooled when he listened to the children picking lice off themselves, who said, what we grasp, we leave behind, and what we do not grasp, we take away with us. And that's a metaphor for the unexamined parts of your own life. And so you see that in a revolution. In a revolution, the things that people are consciously criticizing, they can change. But the things that it never occurred to them to ask questions about, they take with them intact into the new order. And so that's how we can end up with economic medievalism at the same time that we think we've left the medieval era behind. It's because that was not the part that we actually were criticizing. The idea that somebody gets to be Lord, we just reduced that from being, Lord of everything to Lord of the money and the economy. But we didn't question whether anybody ought to really be Lord. We just took that intact with us because that was one of the desiderata, one of the things we wanted. Phil and then James.
Yeah, well that's one of the genius of capitalism, is that, while the Enlightenment thought that we were rational, they understood that really human beings are much more driven by the passions, and so they played upon that. I remember when I was teaching at Penn State, my roommate asked me, he said, do you live on Earth or do you live in the world? I thought it was a trick question at that time, but I've come to realize it was not a trick question, because we live in both worlds. That's where the problem is. And it's like, I remember a beautiful movie called The Red Shoes. The dance director asked this to be his sort of like ballerina that he was gonna, and he said, in order to come to the company, I want to ask you one thing, because you certainly have the potential to be the premier ballerina of my company. He says, do you want to live or do you want to dance? Right? And she thought she wanted to dance. And then later on, she realized she couldn't. And that the pressure between wanting to live and wanting to dance at the same time actually drove her mad and she committed suicide. And here's the situation, like, in fact, you need to I always love the word equivocate. You need to equivocate between those two, and because we have 2 feet after all. What you have 1 feet and you jump to the other feet and jump there, like the basketball metaphor I told you before. I think if you don't realize that you live in both the earth and the world and know how to equivocate, sometimes in one and sometimes in the other, then you're always stuck in one or the other, and that doesn't solve the problem. The trick is to somehow know when to jump in, the driving lane, and when to jump out, and to constantly move. Remember, movement is the part that in a sense allows you to do that, because we do live in time. And so in a sense, I think if you're trapped certainly only in the driving lane, then that's not going to work. Or you're only outside the driving lane, that's not going to work. So these 2 things are kind of important, and they coexist.
Yes.
Whether you see that as a web of weaving, or whether you see it as equivocation, jumping in and out and moving, that's the essential problem that most people have.
Can I disagree completely?
Okay.
Well, before you disagree completely, I want to call on James, because James has had his hand up, and then I'll come back to you. So James, go ahead.
Yeah, wasn't that Nietzsche's point, is that that you have to you have to serve life, as opposed to instead of serving truth. Serving truth, you're willing to sacrifice your life for the truth. And so that his point was that the whole tradition, Western tradition, beginning with Socrates, has been that we're willing to sacrifice our lives to the truth, whatever that truth may be, whatever we believe that truth may be, right? So yes. It takes us to the modern period where we have this myth of the Big Bang beginning with the singularity, and we are, heading for that singularity described by Ray Kurzweil, right? We eventually, no matter how much you may rebel against the system, we're gradually merging with the technology, and right? Giving up our organic cells, our organic life for the truth of our technology.
Right.
And you know, if are we able to resist that, or you know, right? Because I think it looks like, you know, we're either compelled or we are cooperating in that project of becoming what, you know, robo man, or you know, it's going to be eventually reaching that point of singularity where we are one with the technology, and that might be the truth that we're sacrificing ourselves to.
I've read a few like millennial writers now. They've kind of jokingly said that like they wonder how much brain damage they've suffered, you know, as a result of growing up, you know, basically immersed in technology and social media.
No.
It's very deleterious to health. Just all the research shows, especially for teens and young people, very deleterious.
And I think it was definitely a false notion to blame it on them when this was basically, you know, a system of, you know, how to be a young person in this world and how to have status and whatnot. And like this was thrust upon them. Like they did not choose this, right?
What are you going to do when all your friends are Instagram stars, right?
Yeah.
You're going to just create an Instagram, and then that becomes the cult of self. And then you cut yourself off and atomize yourself from the rest of humanity, and you commodify yourself. And people even brag of having a brand, as though that's something to be proud of. My brand.
Yeah.
Sharon, go ahead.
Well, just back to the text on page 14. Dionysian is one of the things I thought you'll probably have to explain, because I had to look that up on first read, because that's where it came. And that whole last paragraph there, I thought probably required some notes.
Sharon, I thought you were going to just like, you had something that you wanted to disagree with Phil on.
Yes, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Second point. Now, Phil, in the movie, when the I guess the instructor asked her if she wanted to dance or she wanted to live, my interpretation of that is a question of passion. If you want to dance and dance really well, that becomes your life. That becomes your whole existence. And I take your point about living in the earth or enjoying life. I think what you decide to be in this life is your passion, but it also drives your whole existence. And I don't think there's any separation. And from my experience, when I went to medical school, I was too young enough to understand that that was going to be my life. That's what makes you stay up all night and all the next day and all the next night, because that's who you are. That's what takes you out of the bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the cold, in the rain, because that's who you are. That is passion. And so I don't see that distinction there. And then the third thing that Dave said, I think every generation has its pathway. And young people are very, very technologically engaged. Yes, and I think they've sacrificed some of the social interaction. When I have Christmas dinner at my house for all the family, everybody leaves their cell phone at the door, because we're going to interact with each other. And they've sacrificed that entity, but I see them and they're seeming to make it work. Yes, they have their brand on Instagram. Yes, they do a lot of communication through the social networks. And the problem with it, those social networks, because they're not monitored, they're extremely fallible. And right now I'm up against that with the vaccine naysayers. You know, I gave a talk to a group of people the other day, and I went around the room and there were vaccine naysayers, and I asked everyone where they got their information from. It was the internet. So that's the huge, huge downside. But I don't think technology is negative, just simply because of our ability as human beings to be adaptive.
Could I just quickly respond to Sharon about this? I need to explain the movie just a little bit more.
Okay.
What happened in the movie is, in the meantime, she had fallen in love with the person who was the conductor for the dance company, and that he has become famous. Okay, so this is made in the 40s. So he is the composer. He's now become a composer, quite a famous composer. And he demanded that she stay at home and be the whatever, like whatever. And so therefore, that was the contrast. And both the director of the company asked her for her, I guess, her passion in dance, if you want to call it that way. And her husband says, I guess, her passion for love, whatever she was in love with. And those were, in some ways, if you want to put it in those terms, both acts were so totalizing that she couldn't choose. So this was finally about, do you want to dance or do you want to live? And that was why he asked that question, because he knew that people would be vulnerable to like such circumstances as, let's say, falling in love. You certainly wouldn't call that a lack of passion as well. So in a sense, he was drawing a line, and you could say both were false promises in their own way. And she didn't know how to, in both extremely demanding circumstances, how to equivocate and find both, or find some middle ground between the two where she could live and dance at the same time.
What is the name of the film, please? What is the name of the film?
Called The Red Shoes.
Oh, yeah.
So she lost her was it her zeitgeist or whatever it is? She lost it, or it became diluted.
Well, there was a pull and another direction of passion, of love, because she truly believed that she wanted to dance. She was an artist, right? She wanted to dance. And in some ways, her husband has kind of demanded that she give that up because he is the composer, right? So there's another dimension, a woman and man dimension there that I didn't explain in the first part. So perhaps
That's a dangerous dimension. I could give a whole big long talk on that dimension.
Right, Sharon. Yeah, right. Exactly, Sharon. We could go on and on and on about that.
Phil, just a quick question. Like, is there a particular thinker or where you're drawing your influence from for using the word specifically equivocate? Like, I guess like when I hear the word equivocate, I usually have a very negative connotation associated with it.
I think that mostly come from me being an artist, okay? Because I have to live in this world. But if you want to draw somebody, I guess to the degree that I understand Nietzsche, he would be important. Or Heidegger, he would be important. To the degree like Merleau-Ponty, he's very important. But they were important to me in terms of the aesthetics more than anything else.
What kind of an artist are you, Phil?
I'm a painter. Mm-hmm. You can check out my art. I'll give it to you. philchantart.com. It's all there.
Yeah.
You ready for another note?
Well, first, Mary Ann had her hand up, so
sorry.
I'll call on her first, and then let's go to the next note.
So when you were talking about what I think is an obsession with a goal, I was thinking of this landscape architect that I read, Lawrence Halpin, and he talked about goals kind of like a music, like you have a life motif and you have like this other motif, and really you have to have the whole orchestra in there. And I don't remember exactly how he said it, but it made me feel that there can be life. You can breathe life into your goals by not looking at it as everything. Think of it as a motif and you're creating something with it. And I also think of that life is a verb, so you have to be able to be adaptive. So that's my input.
Yes.
Yeah, so right. Yeah, Sharon, this paragraph that you picked out on page 14, it's one of the potent ones. He's like capturing a tremendous amount in one paragraph that is not at all obvious. Many of these sentences don't mean what we would take them to mean if we just come at them rapidly with a pop culture first impression. And it takes a while to figure out what he's saying here. Like the way he opens it, talking about myth as a mode of being human, right off the bat is a slap in the face to the way we interpret myth. It's like, no, a myth is just some kind of story or a falsehood. It can't be a mode of being human, right? And he's not bothering to ingratiate himself with the reader at all. He's just directly contradicting what he knows to be their interpretation before he begins unpacking it in the rest of the paragraph. And this idea that I've sort of talked about before, but here he's straight up saying it, that the purpose of myth is to plug us into nature, to get us out of our overly abstracted self-conception of the world and help us to stay in touch with some of the deep principles that actually explain our lives and that we can use over and over to help make decisions wisely in different aspects of our life. He talks about myth and these generative principles of nature as being fertile and fecund, that there's more to them than what they say. They point the way to many, many, many other things. And we can't even guess in advance all the ways in which we're going to use the myth until we start to apply it in our lives. Like the Procrustean bed. Once we really understand the myth of the Procrustean bed, it's not just some story that we've all heard and enjoy. It becomes something we can use to critique almost every part of our lives, individually and socially, civilizationally. It becomes this lens through which all kinds of previously invisible things become visible. And this idea that that's the purpose of myth and that it's a necessary prosthesis we evolved to need is totally alien to the modern worldview, right? The modernist worldview doesn't want to see it that way. So good paragraph there, Sharon. So what was your next note?
Oh, the archaic worldview, farther down the page, the archaic worldview is the most profound conviction that humans are utterly integral to the domain of fertile, flowing nature. Nature is the matrix of the womb that shaped us all of that out of which we become, fluor and physis. And I had those underlined because I had to stop and look them up. So maybe those are notes also.
Yes.
This is where, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, this is also where a graphic actually could be helpful as well. I don't know if you're inserting graphics in this.
Yes.
Say that again, Joseph.
Like a graphic that, shows the interrelationships between some of these.
A diagram. Yeah. That's a great idea. Yeah, that's...
Okay, Phil. Phil is the artist. He can do a diagram, boom, boom, boom. Right, Phil?
No, I don't do diagrams.
I think those two are very kind of different things. Yeah.
Yeah, I do more diagrammatic art, and Phil does more of the other kind of art.
I did find an essay that I'll read into more in depth, but like it's about the art of equivocation. And I didn't realize, like, when I try to paste it, like in the chat, it's a bit long, but I mean, like the original etymology is like having equal voice or equal significance, and I think it's very much pertinent to Kenneth Smith and trying to see things in a new way, and having like there's subjectivity and ambiguity, whereas I think like so much like in our schooling, like we're taught like don't equivocate, in terms of like it has a pejorative in terms of like misleading people, like from like Shakespeare's Macbeth and whatnot. It comes with all that baggage. But I think so I understand better now when Phil says equivocate, like I guess where he's coming from.
Well, I truly believe that the artist stands at the city wall, not at the city gate, at the city wall, because he's both inside the city and outside the city at the same time. Right. As a matter of fact, if you look at most artists who truly are artists, you kind of think of them as like the next step would be he's a criminal, right? In other words, like he is really about as close to being outside of the society as you could be, and we still accept them as like part of society, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of like not only how society sees artists, but artists also see how they see themselves, right? Because they
Phil, are you just talking about fine artists, painters, or are you talking about all artists, like performing artists?
No, all performing art, all artists. I don't mean craftsmen necessarily, although it could be also, but artists who are truly believing in sort of something beyond just representation. So that's what I mean. No, certainly like poets, right? In fact, if you're going to think about a paradigmatic artist, that would be a poet, and then artists, painters, sculptors, dramatists, all of that, dance, certainly.
You see it. When we talk about the two worlds problem, the amphibious problem of the human mind, that we make decisions according to the dreamscape in our heads, but while actually physically living within nature, which has its own rules that are different from those. This is where you can start to see the subversive quality of the artist when they start to, when they do more than just reinforce the dreamscape, but they actually start to challenge it sometimes. They give you a new perspective that reveals more of the underlying hidden reality that we belong to. And that hidden reality tends to be uncompromising with comparison to, we're used to people bending themselves into shape to fit the system of laws and norms, but nature doesn't do that. Nature could care less about our laws and norms. It has its own laws and norms, and they're the actual authority. And so as there is this aspect in which the more Apollinian your culture is, the more offensive you find intrusions from nature, because nature doesn't care, and nature won't comply and doesn't obey. There's this kind of need to control. And so when an artist goes beyond reinforcing the social order and begins to make it enter a dialogue with the deeper nature of things, people can turn and look at the artist the same way they turn and look at nature when it intrudes, like, hey, what are you doing? You're violating the social contract. You're going deeper than we're allowed to go. You're questioning things we don't want to question. And it's part of why a lot of artists say that there's more to art than just pleasing the customer. There's also this what they're involved in might involve showing us things that we would rather not hear, but that we really need to hear, whether we like it or not.
Could I add one more thing to that? Like when you were talking about myth, that we no longer believe in that. In some sense, I almost feel that I myself are partly in that camp, because I'm actually one grade lower than myth, because I believe it's metaphor, okay? That's where the potency is. But I see at that level is that you can recuperate myth. Another myth is something even more mysterious, but I have not lowered down to similes, and analogies. I haven't broken that down that far. I am still on that's why I'm on the city wall, right?
Right.
That's why I'm a city wall. I want to recuperate the myth, but I don't wholly subscribe to it like somebody who truly is mythic. So
right. Well, because you're born into the modern world, right? And this is not a mythic world. And so the journey that we can take, the farthest that we can go, is to the city wall, where we can see them both. It would be some other generation that would have to be raised in a more mythic context that could actually live outside the city wall and tell us nature and myth in its own terms. But we have to be amphibious because of our birth circumstances. Marianne, go ahead.
So I did see Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee movie that Jenny was in. And it is art that is outside the city wall and inside the city wall. And it helped me realize, when I was a young girl, I lived in Cleveland. And in Cleveland, the Huff area burned. And the Cleveland Plain dealer said that they were burning their own place. But years later, I looked it up, and it turned out that the people that owned the stores in Cleveland were actually people that weren't from the neighborhood. And they weren't offering ice water. They weren't offering water to these poor people that would come and buy things, and they couldn't even get a glass of water.
Right.
So when Huff burned, it was for a good reason.
Right.
So thank you, Jenny, for that suggestion.
Jenny rocks.
I'm sorry. Are you talking about Jenny Me?
Yes, Do the Right Thing. You told us about your role in Do the Right Thing.
Do the right thing. Awesome. You
Oh, I forgot that I told you about it. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So Marianne watched it and did some research on the background. So thank you.
Oh, you did. Oh.
Spike Lee's movies are always
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Phil just said, and I was thinking, wait a minute, the way you stated the way society see artists, I just felt like you were saying they're not
subterranean. They're underneath, not on top. Is that what you
yeah,
said?
they're like they're kind of. You said something. You used the word thieves, or not too far from being a thief or something. And I go, wait a minute. I bet you there are plenty of people out there. I mean, why is cinema so popular? I mean, so people are just constantly watching, whether it be on Netflix or going to a movie theater, or they're just like addicted to films and movies and television. So, and there are plenty of people out there who probably would like to be a big star or whatever, even a minor star. So I kind of feel like the way Phil was talking about artists, didn't really gel with me.
I wanted to ask Marianne a quick question. Even if the owners of the store did not live in Cleveland and were the worst people in the world, doesn't burning down the store just strengthen the system? I mean, using violence only emboldens the owners of power to retaliate with their own violence. And since they have all the guns and the ammunition, they're going to win. So, you look at Gandhi and the tradition of nonviolence and how he was able to overthrow the British Empire through nonviolent acts. It seems to me that as soon as you burn down the store, you basically lost the battle. That's if Martin Luther King, instead of saying I had a dream, he said, you know what? In the back, I see as they're about to let the dogs out. Everyone, make a homemade shield and get your bayonet out. I don't think we would remember him the same way. They had such great impact and import for our civilization precisely because they broke out of the system that uses violence to repress and reinforce and strengthen itself. And if we want to evolve past the system, we have to use a different means. We cannot use the same means against it, because then we lose.
I appreciate that, and I think it's a partial truth. And I think that is absolutely true. But what I hear in the flames of Huff and areas like that is that their pain was not recognized. And a cup of water is a great big act. And I think that the Cleveland Plain Dealer, when it said that they were burning their own place down, was offering us a lie so we could be comfortable in our Percustian bed. And I accepted that. And years later, I learned it was a lie.
So, while I honor Martin Luther King as a martyr for what's good, I also honor Malcolm X. I will not forget about Malcolm X.
And it's been written like, I think like James Baldwin, spoke about this, that, at the beginning of their their joined but also individual paths, they had very different views on violence. But, towards the end of their respective paths, they started to really see each other's perspective. So there was kind of a progression in both Malcolm X's thinking as well as Martin Luther King's thinking, and how they affected each other. So I don't think it's not just one kind of static ideal thing. It's interesting that Rick, you brought up Magneto and Professor X earlier, and I'm sure you know this, but for those who aren't aware of this, like in the X-Men, the Superman heroes, like very much like they were metaphors, like Professor X for Martin Luther King Jr. and Magneto for Malcolm X, in terms of like they both kind of have the same end in mind, but like in terms of a repressed minority, you know, like the mutants, or in this, you know, like the civil rights movement, but you know, that had different ways of wanting to get there.
You know who I saw was a synthesis.
I'm gonna jump in here though, because Sharon's had her hand up for a while. So
I wanted to impact this discussion by saying I just finished reading one of Martin Luther King's book that he wrote in the late 60s, early 70s. And the book is called Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos? And in that book, he extensively discussed the difference in the approach, how to impact power. Are you going to be violent? Or are you going to do peaceful resistance? And I think in the end, towards the end of the book, you could see that Malcolm X was adapting some of the techniques of Martin Luther King, and vice versa, because it's nothing is ever absolute. It always has to be about balance. And in the end, what they were trying to impact was power. And there are times in which the power listens to you through different methodologies. So where violence tends to be destructive, I think sometimes it has a role.
So, I believe you immediately cede the moral high ground as soon as you respond with violence, and then it becomes easier to denigrate them and to propagate those lies about their burning. As soon as you pick up a weapon, you've ceded the moral high ground, in my opinion, and I don't think change is possible.
The moral high ground is not there with or without violence. To assume that being nonviolent, you would maintain the moral high ground, I am not sure about the accuracy of that assumption.
I actually see the synthesis in Nelson Mandela, because he started out more like Malcolm X, but he was committed. And I think because he managed to integrate, in a sense, his ideas into a political system, he was able to win. Because I asked somebody who was African about that. He said, why did Nelson Mandela succeed and somebody like Stephen Biko was just killed in prison, right? And he said that he succeeded because he made it impossible for them to kill him in prison.
Well, not quite. Nelson Mandela was confined for a significant period of time. And if you ever read his book, The Long Road to Freedom.
I understand. And most of the guys who attend the prison actually care about the guy. He just became such a magnanimous person that, in a sense, also a political person, in a sense that if they killed him in prison, it would be such a stain in the thing. So he was able to manipulate the system so he came out alive, and he protected the system a lot. I really admire Nelson Mandela.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Dave, I do want to ask you a question, Dave P. I would like to be able to see what you look like for one, but
sorry, I can't.
You're not going to grace us with your face. But so
you could look at the YouTubes the first couple weeks. I'm on those videos.
Oh, okay. We missed our chance then. Okay. So I don't know if you've seen this film called Do the Right Thing, but
I think I saw it like 10 or 15. Wasn't it really old?
Yes, it is.
Sorry? When you were 10 years old, you saw it?
No, I saw it a long time ago.
Oh, okay. So what you're saying is that you do have an issue with that, the meaning of that film then?
No, I don't. I'm saying I don't remember the details at all. I saw it a very long time ago.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It's worth watching, and we could have a whole discussion about Do the Right Thing, because it's a potent story. I put in the chat as well, if people want to look at, there's a David Baldwin documentary from just a few years ago called I Am Not Your Negro, in which they filmed his unfinished book that he was writing about Edgar Everett, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. And I just watched it this last month. It's great. It's
cool. I will check that out. I just want to say, and I put it in chat, I mean, to bring it back to Kenneth Smith, I think there's a reason that, turning the other cheek, love thy neighbor, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think there's a reason that those myths are so enduring in our culture. Those are the myths guiding us. And burning down someone's store does not comport with that type of mythology. So it's just, to me, it seems to serve the
Agreed.
system.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you on that point, David.
And it just perpetuates the very thing that you're looking to overcome. It only gives people a reason to come down harder on you.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Hello, can anybody hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Hi. Hi,
Oh,
Karen.
okay. Hi, my name is Karen. It's interesting, you know, I think besides prejudice, I think we're criticized for how we look and how we conduct ourselves. I have very long blonde hair and I'm an artist, I'm a crafter, and I'm proud of it. Into affiliate marketing, so there's many facets to my personality and my interests vary. I'm a baby boomer, I'm from the 1960s and 70s. And I think we all have to learn to endure and appreciate each other's differences. And we're all very insecure, and that leads to detrimental things. We're competitive by nature. And when push comes to shove and the Titanic is sinking, we all look out for ourselves. Unfortunately, this is the way human nature is. I don't know if you want to disagree with me on that. You've got nice people and you have very nice people. And then you have people who are just not nice. They're out for themselves. They have no concern for anyone but themselves. And when they walk by you, you're simply invisible. So it doesn't matter what age you are, you know, really even what you look like nowadays. The younger generation, the millennials, Generation Z, I find are very lazy, unconcerning, everything's irreverent, and they have no concern for older people. And
No, I cannot
wait,
agree with you
excuse
on
me,
that.
can you give me a minute? Wait, I'm just
Yeah,
giving my
yeah.
opinion. Excuse me, please don't interject. I mean, you know, hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, honey, I lost you. Okay, yeah, you're controlling the conversation, hon? Because I already had I already came from one place where she bumped me off because I had technical difficulty. I wasn't rude or anything. But I'm just saying, look, I gave you your time to talk, and I came in on the back end, and I wanted to thank you guys for your, I had no technical problem with you guys, and I do appreciate that, you know, and that you didn't bump me off because I was having technical problems prior to this. But some people are just rude. But no, I'm not saying all, you know, older people too, but I think we need to exercise more patience with each other and learn to love one another, just like in the 60s, you know, love children and stuff like that. I think we need to go back to that era and exercise some patience and respect for each other. I think this world would really be a lot better, because the way it's going now is not pretty. It's not pretty. And you know what? And this, I believe, I'm from the 60s. So my parents, they didn't spoil us. We had to work. We didn't make a lot of money. But these kids of today want everything handed to them on a silver platter. And if it's not, they don't deal with it very well. They don't deal with adversity. In order to be successful, you need to go through failures as well as successes. And to judge somebody, excuse me, to judge somebody on whether, okay, you're interjecting again. I'm going to let you go. But like if somebody's wearing Nike sneakers and another kid can't afford it, you know, these kids are really tough these days where they,
Karen, I'm going to jump in here. I'm the moderator on this call.
Sorry,
Did you have something that you wanted to say about the Kenneth Smith essay that we're going through?
No, I had all that I had to say. I thought this was about art, not, you know, and, you know, I was following your conversation to a degree. But,
yeah,
you know, I mean, I can get off.
This is a conversation we've been having over, like, you know, months now. And we kind of like, so it's sort of, yeah, like a lot of us, we know each other as regulars. I mean,
so
you're welcome to join, but I think.
Okay, why don't you make this a private group and not invite anybody? No, have a great day.
That's not, okay.
Rick, are we, is this meeting for 2 hours or is it 3? I keep forgetting.
3.
It is 3 because it's listed as 2 hours. So
yeah,
I was confused.
2 is the maximum that they'll allow us to list it for. But we,
well, you know, but I don't know if Karen is still here, but I mean, you know, I
Yeah,
think there are so many
let's move on. Maybe let's go back to
millennials who are very respectable, and I mean, even in my own family, my son got his master's graduate degree in green energy, renewable energy, whatever. I mean, and then my niece is working on her postdoctorate in atmospheric science to, you know, to try and see what's going on with the atmosphere and how we can turn the climate change around and all that. So there are plenty of millennials and younger generations who are doing the right thing and who are thinking in a very I respect a lot of millennials out there, you know, personally, people who are out there,
yeah,
younger people.
I think we're mostly in agreement about that, Ginny.
Exactly. What most people do, right?
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
a matter of how you handle a certain situation. As an example, I remember somebody told me that they were tired of people cutting in line in the grocery store, right? And so you could either like just wait in line and just be seething inside while you're doing that, or else you could go and start a fight, right? And I told them like, oh yeah, that somebody cut in front of me and a whole grocery full of stuff. Didn't cut in front of me, it was in front of me, but it was in the express lane. And so I just said, I didn't start a fight and I wasn't seething. I just asked people like, does anybody know where the express lanes is? Because I can't seem to find it, right? In other words, just issuing the fact that I know there's something wrong here.
Yes.
Somebody to take care of. That is the in-between zone that you are acknowledging that you're aware of this, that they were really righteous. They should like, oh, excuse me, get out of here or whatever. But you don't just let it go. You say something, but you don't want necessarily have to start a fight over that.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, sorry, Rick. We've diverged again as always. So
okay. It's our way.
What's that?
It's our way. It's what we do on these calls, right? We riff.
Yeah. But I have tendency to do that very easily, so I apologize.
It's quite all right. Go ahead, Sharon.
So can I tell you an interesting story that happened in my neighborhood last week?
Please.
And it's about passion and the way we deal with people. And I understand what Karen just said, because she's moved on. I saw when she first came on that she's from Florida. So a professional, an anesthesiologist, is in a supermarket, and she's standing behind a Latin man. And the Latin man says to her, can you stand back? Because, you know, I need to social distance. And she gives him an ethnic slur. And so they both go outside. She follows him and abuses him. He starts calling the cops. She hits his phone out of his hand, steps on it, then keys his car. And though she gets arrested now for a hate crime. So the question I asked is, yes, they're rude people. And when you become a professional, it's expected that you understand certain boundaries. At what point do you risk it all like that? Because she's lost her license, she's lost her job, she's 58. Mm-hmm. A hate crime is a serious thing.
Yeah.
You know, so we need patience, we need temperance, and we need discipline. You know, because we all have a lot to lose in the long run, or even in the short run.
I mean, it's interesting how difficult these ethical questions are. You know, everyday situations that come up constantly put us in scenarios where there aren't any easy answers. And if we try to deal with them by a recipe that we've sort of memorized as our schema, we'll find ourselves being wrong frequently. We have to bring our creativity to bear on these situations. You're right.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you do? So you had pointed us at the paragraph with the archaic worldview and talking about Fua and Phusis.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think you're right. Those both need notes, and yeah, a diagram there would be handy. Because that's some potent stuff. I think also a note referencing that archaic here doesn't just mean old, but refers to the archaic Greeks when they're close to the archai of their civilization, the founding principles, in a way that later generations weren't, is worth talking about here, because we know he means that. And it's why later in the same sentence, you know, he's in the same paragraph, he's talking about the matrix or the womb. You know, that's a reference to those deep principles, the archai, that generate physis, that generate nature, the flow.
And to further, like, kind of your response to Sharon's retelling of that tale there, like, you know, like that we can't just follow a schema. I mean, like, you know, I think, like, you know, what study of philosophy, I think, you know, ideally could, or, you know, encompasses, and I think what the Greeks were a lot concerned about, and I think Kenneth Smith as well, is, you know, to somehow get wisdom, to become more wise, I guess, like in our studies of this, like, and have that guidance in life. Yeah.
Yeah.
From the quote last week, drip by drip.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Doesn't mean we won't make mistakes. Doesn't mean like our minds won't change, right? But yeah.
And to stay flexible, I think, as well in our own thinking, just to remain flexible. Brittle branches break, flexible branches can bend.
Yes.
Well said, Dave. Well said. Well said.
That's right. Okay. Other things on page 14, or should we move on?
Page 15.
Okay. What do you got?
I
know you have something.
Yes, I do. This paragraph needs. I am presenting it because it's what I struggled with when I was reading it. The delusion of self-begotten ego is manifestly portrayed in Sophocles' portrait of radical impropriety in Oedipus.
Yes.
Now, a short bit about Oedipus's story here would be helpful, particularly as though he goes on to say Oedipus's whole attitude of arrogated autonomy and apathy toward the question of his origins makes him a veritable archetype or private of self-possessed mentality. And I remember we talked about this extensively in our first discussion about this, because I have notes on it. So that would probably be
That's good.
Yeah, like I think, you know, there's some stuff to unpack here, but I think like most readers, when they first see this, won't necessarily get at what Kenneth Smith is trying to get at, because like you know, myself, like, you know, having been a big fan of Greek mythology, we sort of saw like Oedipus's tale as just sort of this awesome shit show, but like not really understanding like like and then like, you know, and then like we fixate on like, oh, like, you know, like the thing with, you know, like with him and his mother together, right? But like I guess the greater tale of like, I think what's trying to be communicated by Oedipus' tale is gets missed, I think, because of those associations.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's explicate that. And looking at this sentence too, I think we also need to unpack idiotes, because everybody's going to think that means idiots as in dummies or fools, and they're not going to get that it's about people who are too focused on their own concerns. And
that's right. Very good.
Inherently sets us up for danger. So that's good. Thank you. We'll do that. Okay, good. What's next?
So Ate and Aries, next paragraph down. No, even the second reading, I still didn't get those two very well.
Should we talk about Ate and Aries?
Yes.
So, you know, Aries, god of war, right? And war is about forcing things the way you want them to be, right? So there's no discussion. There's we don't need laws. All we need is whoever's the strongest enforces their will on others. And Aries, thus, is a model for one way of interacting with the world that all too many people try to do. But Ate is another goddess who's much less well known. She's not one of the 12 Olympians, but she's one of the kind of constellation of deities around them. She means infatuation. Ate is the way that people get infatuated with things. And it's in some ways the opposite of war, because you could be all full of purpose and determination to conquer other people and to have your way. But if something can tickle your fancy, it can draw you completely off your path into a different direction. This is one. There's the dialectic between Ate and Aries was central to Greek civilization, and it was also central to the collapse of the Roman Republic, and it's replaced by an empire. So Richard in the chats talks about Mars, the Roman equivalent, and how important he was to the Romans. It's one of the interesting turning points in the history of Rome when the Republic was having so much military success that they began to put Mars as their first god, the god that they focused on more than others. They would still say, sure, Jupiter's theoretically in charge, but procession after procession after procession is going to be Mars because, yay, we conquered again, we conquered again, we conquered again. And that's how somebody like Julius Caesar, a great conqueror, could just declare himself emperor, because he was riding the coattails of the public infatuation with, the power of warfare and what Rome was able to do for itself when it set aside all the other considerations and just tried to conquer. And that became Rome's whole schema for their civilization. Now, there's an interesting parallel with the Greeks, with Ares, because Athens is named after Athena, is supposed to be the city of wisdom. But when they formed the Delian League to fight against the Persians, when they drew together all of the Greek city-states to send in money to Athens, that Athens would use to build the military force that was used to repel the Persians, what happened is after the Persian War, Athens didn't want to give that up. Mm-hmm. And so they used persuasion to tell everybody, well, hey, what about the next Persia to come along? We really need to be militarily prepared because we wouldn't want that to happen again. And so they had everybody keep sending them money. And the abuse of that is what led to the Peloponnesian War. It's why Sparta broke away ultimately and said, you know what? Screw you. You're just taking all our money and making yourself wealthy and powerful. You're a wannabe empire, and you're supposed to be peers with us. We're supposed to be negotiating through discussion, through patho, persuasion. That's supposed to be what rules us, not, haha, you've got all the money and all the empire, so now we have to do what you say. And ultimately, it was the downfall. So that problem of the way that republics are seduced out of a culture of persuasion and into a culture of war is one that has been much commented upon by historians. I mean, it hit Athens, it hit Rome, it hit us. That's why we're the world's largest military empire. We were in theory supposed to be all about a new government separate from, the old ways of Europe that with its endless wars. But once we got a taste for conquest, we had the same problem that Rome and Athens had, which is, wow, it's kind of cool to be the big boss and kick around all the other monkeys and get what you want. You can get rich that way. So there's this interesting trinity here between Patho and Ares, who are in opposition to each other, except that the way that you can be devoted to Patho, but you can become infatuated with Ares and lose your way. And Ate is the goddess who rules infatuation, the loss of your path, the deviation. So like the apple, the classic example of Ate is the Trojan War, right? The apple that's rolled out in front of the goddesses that they then fight over. And they demand that somebody has to, say who's the most deserving of the apple. And so they have Paris. It was Paris who judged Aphrodite as the winner. And that's why Aphrodite gave him the gift that he could seduce any woman he wanted. So he seduces Helen, which leads to the Trojan Empire, the Trojan War, which leads to the collapse of Troy and everything that Paris held dear. There's this, Ate's use of infatuation that you at first think is a minor thing, but it could unravel and unravel and unravel a whole civilization, is the great power that's hidden within her. The Greeks understood that in a way that we really don't, because what have we done? We've made Ate the engine of our economy, right? Get what you want. The market will provide what you want. All you have to do is focus on your desires, the things that you crave, that call to you, and everything good will come from that. Will make a civilization. So there's a way in which modernism is the mirror image, the reverse of the Athenian or archaic Greek, specifically because they were afraid of Ate. And that's why the Iliad was their national epic, was to say, see what Ate did? Whereas we love and worship Ate as the that's why we do politics, that's why we do economics. You can get what you want. Marianne, you've got your hand up.
I went to the island Delos in Greece. And in that, I felt that they had a real interesting take on the Martian. When people came from war, they would go to Delos and they would be enfolded into the sacred female. And
Yes.
in that enfoldment, they were being purged of the Martian kind of ethics. And so then afterwards, they could go into civilization again. And I thought it was a brilliant idea for post-traumatic stress. And also a good way for the priest or whatever they were to steal whatever they had, the pillage from other civilizations. So I just kind of felt that Dulles was a beautiful space.
Yeah. That's incredible. I'd completely forgotten that Delos played that role for the Greeks. I put in the comment how similar that is to the way that the Navajo did the enemy way for returning soldiers, where they had to make their peace with the things that they'd done and set aside the ways of war and rejoin civilization, which the Navajo saw as having been laid out by changing women as being the realm of the female, that weaves peace together and weaves a whole. That's a fascinating comparison. Thank you, Marianne. Sharon and then James.
I'm trying to make a connection here and follow up on something that Dave said, based on a sentence that you just said, that we've moved from a culture of persuasion, right?
Yes.
And into a power of war. And Dave was just talking about nonviolence versus violence. So I'm trying to make the connection here in this paragraph.
Yes.
I need help.
That's the thing that's going on here. When he invokes Ate and Ares, he's thinking about the Trojan War. And
yes,
the apple that tempted the goddesses is, that's the most famous example of Ate in action. And of course, it leads to the war. It leads to Ares. So that's where the linkage is. And he doesn't say Peitho in this paragraph, but he's thinking it, right? Because it was while they were ruled by Peitho that the different Mycenaean city-states were able to negotiate with each other. But once they lost Peitho and turned away to Ares, then everything collapsed and they entered the Dark Age after the Trojan War. That was what happened. That was the power of Ate.
Ate and Ares. Okay.
James, go ahead.
Yeah. So to understand the story of Oedipus, it's really not due to something that is a personal fault that he had, but he was just a victim of the circumstances, a victim of that culture or that forces that are outside his control. It was nothing, he was innocent, right? In a sense.
Well,
is that what you're asserting?
Story, right? The modern interpretation is that he was innocent and all these things just happened to him. But the archaic Greek interpretation is that he would have seen these things coming and taken a different path if he had a different personality. He had the kind of personality that makes him ill-suited to lead because he wasn't inquisitive enough about the larger picture that he was a part of. He kept trying to act in the world as an ego, a problem solver who just dealt with things as they came up. He thought he didn't need to inquire into his own origins. He didn't need to inquire into the bigger picture. He would just take things in isolation. And so the myth of Oedipus is showing how if you just take things in isolation, then no matter how smart you are or how powerful you are, nevertheless, you can set in motion the very worst things you can imagine as a result of your own actions. That this is a kind of innocence that's more like a landmine, and that it's not safe for a civilization to try to build itself out of people who have that particular kind of innocence, a kind of parochial, blindness to the bigger picture.
This is very
like a naivety.
It's very much the heart of like the title, of these collection of essays like Mythos and Logos, right? It's basically this uncoupled logos, like problem solving, as opposed to having Mythos basically understanding kind of where we come from and where we fit in to this. So I think, it's maybe James, you weren't here in earlier when we talked about Oedipus, but it's like that's what I was kind of referring to, is that like stuff just happens to this guy and it's a shit show, and that's sort of the modern, like, what we get out of it, like how we,
Right.
so like the whole story of, like, you know, how his kind of like this problem solving, you know, kind of gets him into different places, and then for a while looks good for him because he's a ruler, but then he killed his father, you know, and like married his mother, and then later, like, all sorts of tragedy befalls him, right? And then there's a redemption, right? And then it's sort of like,
Right.
you know, like the whole you know, it's like the blind man is the one who can see, you know, like that's harkens, you know, back to like Shakespeare's King Lear and whatnot, right? That also the moderns, we don't really focus much on. We sort of like, yeah.
It's amazing the extent to which we still read Oedipus Tyrannus, but don't read Oedipus at Colonna. It's like we're cutting off the redemption story and how that happened.
That's the problem.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, this all comes back to the problem of any kind of singularity. In this sense, it seems like plurality is necessary for us to be in balance. I remember saying to this group once, you know, like, there are 3 types of serious people. There are the serious people, which I call it the analytical, the scientists, and so forth. And then there are the people who understand that kind of serious that doesn't work because there's something a bit in the human ethos that doesn't conjive with that. In other words, things would never really work. Okay, then you could fall into chaos and, you know, and nihilism. And then I say, yeah, well, then where do you go? I said, well, then I think the best you could do is like live in a principle in which you do the best you can and live the most beautiful life possible. Okay, and I believe that. But the problem is, in some sense, as an artist, that itself could be a problem, because somebody asked me, like, isn't there a problem with that? I say, yes, I am afraid. I am afraid of being seduced by beauty, right? If that's the only thing that's introduced, because if that is the only input into me making a judgment about how the world should be to live the beautiful life, then that itself falls into seduction. And so even that as a kind of a tenuous relationship that you have to also equivocate in and out of to a certain degree, right? Even as much as you believe in it. So therefore, that's why you need some kind of plurality to, in a sense, steer you outside of that. Otherwise, any kind of singularity, you're wrapped up within oneself. So that's another lesson that I kind of think that I hate to go back to the fact that in some ways this sort of multiculturalism. I mean, I think that's a good thing because it criticizes you, even if you think you're right, even though you basically live a very virtuous life, you still need input.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the deeper lessons of Theseus. If he'd been raised like all the other parochial people, he would have met the same fate that they did at Procrustes' house, because with one limited perspective, it wasn't enough to see through the trap that he was entering. It was only because he'd been seeded with these cosmopolitan, wiser perspectives as he was growing up that he was able to bring that to bear. There's this, when you talk about equivocation, you know, I'm increasingly, that's still sitting with me. I'm thinking about it more, about how the philosophy of polytheism, the idea that there's not one answer, there's not one source of meaning, there's not one destination, but instead we're caught up in these complex relationships in nature, and that we have to watch many things. We have to pay attention to many things and learn from many things. And if we do that, we're sort of better served in life than if we try to boil everything down to one answer that we will always follow. You know, the single answer, the single system is inherently brittle and prone to failure. It's in the creativity of bringing different perspectives to bear, equivocating between them, and not committing zealously to just one of them, that we gain the ability to respond, you know, in a living way to our changing circumstances.
I'll tell you one story that where I understood that I was wrong. When I was at Berkeley, I complained so much. I had transferred to Berkeley. I complained very much to my dean. I actually had an appointment with a dean. You know, like, why am I forced to take a language? You know, and after seeing my records, he actually said, personally, I don't care if you take language. Okay. Now I could have taken that as an out, no problem. Okay. But he said, for heaven's sake, you got to understand in an economic structure, language is one of the few tools we have to make sure our students don't become parochial, right? And it wasn't that he wants you to learn a language, he wants you to be exposed to a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing. And that hit me so much that I said, you know, he's right. I'll just go and suffer through and learn a language, right? he actually won the argument. I could have taken the easy way out, but Dean, you told me that you could care less, right? But I decided not to hold him to his promise because he was right.
What language did you sign up for, and do you still remember any of it now? Just curious.
No, you know, I when I was in China, I knew Cantonese, but when I came to America, I pretty much forgot most of my Cantonese. And so because I was so busy learning English, as a matter of fact, most people are amazed, you know, how articulate I am as a foreign speaker. But so I compromised and decided to take Chinese, but I took Mandarin, which is essentially a different language. It was like very, very difficult for me, but I struggled through it, you know, and didn't get a good grade, but I struggled through it and I suffered through it because the dean was right.
It broadens your mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We have Marianne, then Dave, then Sharon, then James.
So one thing I wanted to say is just an aside to get it over, is that I equivocate, especially when I'm around men that think they know what they know. And so I try to get them involved in the process of my thinking. So I equivocate just like Phil did in the grocery store. And the other thing is that I love beauty. It makes me mystical. I can feel my spirit. And I do want to be in love with my spirit. So when I can get lost in beauty, I do it. I just do it.
Nice. Thank you, Marianne. Dave, I think you're next.
I've been satisfied. You can go to someone else.
Okay, Sharon.
I just want to say that, first of all, I like the word equivocate, but it's the plurality of anything that's worthwhile that makes you equivocate. And I think that's how you engage with your spiritual maturity. That's what the road less traveled is all about. So I don't have any problems with equivocation. I saw Richard put up a whole big long essay of it. I think it's healthy to equivocate because it allows you to see different sides of entities, of situations, and that's how I think you get wisdom.
I agree, but I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of baggage that comes with like equivocation historically, and then to understand, like, you know, whether like that's being brought up or not, I guess. Yeah, like it's the context of
So Richard, this is the thing we keep running into with philosophy, right? That all of the most important terms have been overloaded with meanings that blunt them in popular culture to prevent people from having the insights that would make them rock the boat. And so we find ourselves sort of at sea where if you want to say something philosophical, there's really no word that can come out of your mouth that doesn't carry this baggage that leads you away from the meaning that you're trying to say. And as a result, the act of communicating in a philosophical way becomes inherently a struggle, an agon. And this goes hand in hand with the heuristic ethos of agon, that you have to struggle to grow and to differentiate yourself. And one of the struggles that you have to do inherently is that all of the terminology is pre-formatted to point the wrong way. And so, you know, there's like this inherent struggle against misunderstanding in order to try to say the things that need to be said. It's fascinating.
But there's some truth in the modern interpretation, because when you sit in the fence, they'll ultimately say, you're either with them or you're with us, right? And then then you kind of got to say, well, I'm kind of actually with both of you.
Yes.
Right? I mean, and then they say, oh, you're with them then. We don't want you.
right. If you're not against them, then you're with them. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. James, you got your hand up.
Yeah, you're talking about the Procrustean bed. The modern version of that, is that are you familiar with Gödel's law? Is that a modern version of that kind of way of preventing one from that from being falling into the trap of the Procrustean bed.
So Gödel's one of my favorites. I first learned about him from Gödel Escher Bach, The Eternal Golden Braid by Douglas Hofstadter. I love the way that he comes up with a general principle that says it's not possible to make a pure, perfect theory or model, because no matter how carefully you do it, it casts a shadow over its subject. It either says that some things, it claims that some things are true that are actually false, or it claims that some things are false that are actually true, and there's just no escaping it. And the more you try to add to your theory to prevent that from happening, the more shadows it casts, because now it's a bigger theory. It's got more complications to it. And so, you know, he does a great job, I think, in that intrinsically, you can see how that's a critique of Verstand that says, you know, the quest for the perfect intellectual system that says everything right and nothing wrong is doomed to failure from the outset. And that instead, we have to have a more nuanced, tasteful, and difficult approach to modeling the world, in which we're constantly going back to the world to double check things and recognizing where we've got seams that we just can't get around. Yeah, Gödel's incompleteness theorems, that's right. So it's relevant here. I mean, I think of it as the Procrustean bed is what happens if you don't pay heed to Gödel, right? If you start to think that your perfect systems of thought are in fact perfect, then you'll be inclined to put everything on the bed even if it doesn't fit, which Gödel warns you not to do. Right?
Rick, can I, Rick, I want to just make a comment. You know your favorite word, Rick, do you know what your favorite word is?
My favorite word?
Yeah.
I don't. What's my favorite word?
Verstand.
I do say Verstand.
I didn't know that word, and I you know, and since because of you, I love that word, and I think it's a wonderful word. But it just count how many times Rick says Verstand during one meeting.
Yeah, Verstand and Begriff, they're constantly coming out of my mouth. But you know, part of what I love about those words, and gnosis and noesis, is that Greek and German can say really basic, important things about the nature of thought that we can't say at all in English. There just aren't words like that in English. And it's just fascinating to be able to look straight at the trap of the language and see it so clearly. It's part of why I bring them up so often, it fascinates me. So
I haven't heard anybody else use that word until you used it. And
I got to read a little more Hegel in the German.
Yeah, and to be clear, Jenny, we're critiquing for Verstand a lot.
We are.
I almost felt like we need a lexicon before we start looking at this, because I get lost sometimes.
So Verstand is the opposite of Begriff, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so
So should we add a lexicon to this book?
That's what I was just about to like actually recommend. Yes, I was just about to bring that up now that you just
I saw your finger come up, and then you didn't say anything. Oh, Joseph's about to ask this question.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I thought. I thought that you should definitely add a lexicon, and yeah, that would actually.
Should you add Dasein too? Dasein is like the most used word in Hegel's phenomenology of mind or spirit.
Or is it Hegel or is it Heidegger? That I think Heidegger.
Well, Heidegger, you know, later on uses it for the main description of who we are.
Does Dasein come into, like, I know you've brought it up, but does it come into play in Kenneth Smith's essays very much? I don't recall that it's come up.
Well, it's from Hegel, and then Kenneth Smith refers a lot to Hegel, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
Yeah, I find with Kenneth Smith, it's helpful to extend the vocabulary, which on the surface is a terrifying thing to do because his vocabulary is already bigger than mine. So, but you know, if you go to his sources, if you go to Hegel and Heraclitus and others, they're going to be using terminology that he's familiar with, even if he doesn't say it. And if you get it out there like Dasein and you define it and see what it is, you can then start to notice where it is in Kenneth Smith that doesn't say it, where he's thinking, you know. So
I'm sorry, Rick, but would you mind spelling the word Verstand?
Oh, Verstand, yeah. And it goes with Begriff, right? Begriff is the concrete particular, and Verstand is the abstract universal. And his resolution of the two, which almost nobody uses as a term, it took me a long time to find it, Kenneth Smith never uses it, is Vernunft. And Vernunft is when you resolve the conflict, the dialectic between Begriff and Verstand to create a new mode of thought that
That's
is
the
simultaneously.
synthesis.
It's the synthesis of the two that grounds our idea systems in reality instead of letting them float away into into the traps we get stuck in, right?
So it's a
There's,
VERSANDT or
Yeah.
It's look at the chat. Look at the chat, Ginny. Can you bring up the chat window? Yeah, I typed it out.
oh, VERSTAND. Okay.
Earlier in the talks, he made a very nice diagram with this.
Yeah.
I'll put that in the back of the book too.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Pertinent to the book, I was going to ask, will you be numbering the text? Because I find that encourages deeper exploration, and since it's so dense, it might make sense to use a numbered system for, where each paragraph gets a number or something like that. So then when people can say, oh, I'm referring to 17, because it's such a dense text, and that really does encourage people to dig in.
maybe I should do that. That's certainly how Hegel is handled. All of his paragraphs in Phenomenology of Geist are numbered for that.
Yeah, we're reading Jung, and it's numbered, and it's really makes it a lot easier to study.
Yes, it is.
Is there more than to just like I've heard this kind of called like aphorisms, like where it's numbered, like does that like kind of invoke a different thing? Like
aphorisms are usually condensed, deliberately, and frequently they're one sentence. They might be as much as two, but you couldn't call a Kenneth Smith page-long paragraph an aphorism. It might be full of aphorisms, but
Okay, just numbering paragraphs. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, we could do that. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, when you were talking about Shadow War, it occurred to me that there was a movie. I actually haven't seen this movie. I only saw this one still picture, but of these black people walking by in the street. But he took the movie from a kind of a top down, so that you could see that the shadows were more real than the people
from above.
And I remember that particular still because it reminded me of Alexander Rodchenko's still picture, because he was a painter, but he was an artist, but he took photography too, and which was kind of astonishing because this was done in the 1920s, in which he had two people walking to a building, and you could see the shadow on the building, and that became the main feature. So I wonder whether that was just purely like artistic, inspirational, a new way of seeing things, or whether he wasn't already in his own way secretly criticizing, the political system, right? That it produces a shadow reality. So that was very interesting. I wish I knew how to like share with you right now that particular picture, because Alexander Rodchenko is a very, very good artist.
You can put his name in the chat.
A Russian constructivist artist. Okay.
Yeah, put his name in the chat. We can chase him down.
Okay.
Sharon and then Marianne.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on what Phil just asked. Isn't that what Plato's allegory of the cave is all about?
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. And of course, the allegory of the cave has this incredible expressive power until you know how he meant it. And then it has this incredible obscuring power. Because of course, the way he meant it is that reality isn't real. Only the world of imaginary forms is real. And that we're the shadows.
Yes.
Which he got it backwards, right? But again, that's why I like Ernst Cassirer's books on myths from the early 20th century, when he puts Plato back on his feet and says, actually, Plato perfectly described our inner world and how it's more real to us than the outer world, and that we treat the outer world as though it's just shadows. But the true relationship is that it's what's in our mind that's the reflection or shadow of what's outside, and that we have a foreground background problem in understanding which one is the real one casting the shadow. And Plato fell afoul of that. So there's a National Geographic photo you guys have probably all seen of camels walking through a desert. And it takes you a moment to realize that you're not looking at camels, you're looking at the shadows of camels, that there's these tiny thin little things at the edge that are the actual camels because you're looking from above. And it's sunset and their shadows are stretched out onto the sand, so that you think that you're seeing camels when you're actually seeing shadows of camels. That's what Phil's example makes me think of is that photo. Marianne, did you step away, or should we call on you now or in a moment? I think she stepped away. We'll call on her in a moment. So my family are amateur linguists. We just sort of collect phrases and words from languages and sounds and so forth. So Quechua is a language I'm really interested in. It's from South America, for those of you who don't know. It's an indigenous language. The indigenous languages have all kinds of ideas about the world in them that aren't present in Indo-European languages. It's a very different conception. And so if you study the grammar and vocabulary of indigenous languages, even if you never learned the language, if you just look at what, how's it constructed and what are some of the ideas it has, it can blow your mind open. So as an example, thinking about Begriff and Verstand, where we look at these words, or gnosis and noesis from Archaic Greek, where we say, Jesus, how have we made it this far without these words? How do we even understand each other without these words? They're so important. I'm going to now tell you something from a Quechua language that'll make you say the same thing. In Quechua, they have suffixes that they add to their words, and they mostly add them to the first word in the sentence. And the suffix says, how do you know this? So there's a suffix that means it's hearsay. Somebody told me this, but I have no direct experience of it. And there's another suffix that means it would be reasonable if it were true, what I'm saying. Probably so. And there's another suffix that means I personally know this because I experienced it. So this is like building Begriff and Verstand and other ideas directly into your language, so that you can't even say a sentence without revealing whether you're just passing along what you've been taught or whether this happened to you yesterday or what have you. And now I find myself thinking, how does any language get along without immediately identifying whether I'm just, intellectualizing because I'm so sure of myself, or whether I got actually stung by a bee yesterday and you should know about this, It's like, this is powerful.
So it's actually basically encoding directly in the language. You could do it as a markup or whatever, or those of us who've worked with programming languages, understand strongly typed, weakly typed, or whatever. But I guess within this particular, language, linguistic language, you're encoding the foundation of knowledge for everything that you're saying.
Yeah, they call it evidentiality. So the evidence for what you're saying gets built into the language. And if you're staying in the same mode, if you're just talking for pages about something that somebody told you, you only use the suffix the first time. And then it's understood in Quechua that unless they see the suffix show up again, it means that you're in the same mode. So you could just talk for a long time about your experiences and only have the suffix once, or you could talk a long time about hearsay. Or you could have a conversation about the difference between what you were taught and what you actually experienced and what you think is likely so, where in the same sentence, you might use the suffix multiple times to distinguish the different pieces of information and how likely they are to be true or how you know it. And I find myself thinking, how did any human language ever manage to communicate anything without these suffixes? They're so essential. It's like every time I open my mouth now, I'm aware of how naked these words are, and there's really no basis for anybody to understand what I mean by them. Why am I saying these things? Where is this all supposed to be coming from?
I could see that you're a troublemaker because you're trying to destroy the Trump world by introducing this idea.
Yeah, it really questions the whole basis of human communication. Like, oh God, now I want to make up a language that has these.
Genius. I wonder what else we've lost from those ancient cultures in that vein. It makes me think that in the same way that, Britain colonized all of those other countries, our hyper-logos culture is colonizing our very language and removing those subtleties.
So
yeah,
they have such a thing as gossip in that language.
They do, and they have a suffix for it.
Oh, okay.
How do they treat misuse of the suffix? I'm just curious, or does it not really occur?
It's considered a grammatical error. If you don't correct yourself and don't respond well when you're corrected, people stop listening to you because they treat you as a babbler, as just gibberish.
Oh, okay.
So but there's no prison involved, though, right?
No. The social correction is that people distance themselves from you because who knows what you're saying? Do you even know? I mean, if you can't make these distinctions, why should anyone listen to you? Which then suggests that all of all of modern civilization is subject to this criticism. How do we know any of this stuff?
And in a culture like that, being socially isolated is, that is prison, right? I mean, your very livelihood depends on the people you live with.
Yeah, that's right. So Marianne, you had your hand up.
I have a burning question about Phil's drawing. Right on the side of your bookshelf, there is this woman in shadow. And when you were talking about shadow, I was like, I would really like to understand that drawing. So can you walk me through it?
It would be too involved. I once did that, and no, I once did that, and the thing, it might have even been in this program, and somebody says it was just essentially one person talking for a very long time. So I don't want to do that. But if you go to my website, there's a number of artist statements that I have that kind of explains it in general.
What's the name of that artwork? What's the name of that artwork? What's the title?
I don't really have a title. They're all fallen angels.
Fallen angels.
Did you do the art?
No, I'll do just a very short part. Fallen angels are not what we think, like Lucifer and all that. They're really human beings, right? Because most of them, this one doesn't have it, but most of them have wings, but they don't fly. We want to fly, but we're grounded. That's why we're fallen as human beings. So in some ways, it's kind of like Greek thinking in a way. I think of myself as Greek in some sense. So that's what it is. It's humanity that wants to become truly human. I think human beings, there's two kinds of human beings. You're born and you're part of mankind. Oh, now it's hard to say mankind without saying womankind at the same time. But in order to be human, you have to, in a sense, go to the next level, which is essentially wanting to be more, which is becoming human, but you're still not an angel because you can't fly. You want very much. That's why you have wings. That's what it is. Just look at my website, please.
But did you do that art yourself, Phil?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're at the end of our third hour. Thank you, everybody. This has been marvelous.
You're saying it's been marvelous. Oh, there you go.
Can I just say something?
Did we get through two sentences? Or what do we do?
We're up to 17, page 17.
Page 17.
But before we get to page 17, I want to put this in the pack or in the backpack for next week, because I found this a very, very big topic. He referred to John Holland Smith, The Death of Classical Paganism. That's a mouthful. That's at the bottom of page 16.
Bottom of page 16.
Yeah,
yes.
Last paragraph.
Yes.
That is a very big topic. I spend a lot of time reading about it, and I like his analogy about the extremities live on like a chicken without its head, just as Greek mythology lived on like dismembered Orpheus, surviving its life-giving cultures by centuries.
Yes.
That, I think, is a lot. So could we start there next time?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Hey, well, thank you, Rick, and thank you. Where's David? David.
Oh, he had to go.
And so Kenneth Smith is
I'd
Tuesday.
like to know the meaning of David's stool. I don't, David, what does that mean that you have a stool there? Is there a symbolism to that stool?
It's a chair.
I can come up with
It's
one.
not the chair.
Oh, you're off the, oh, he's off the chair. Oh, okay, okay.
So we'll do this next Monday.
Yes.
And then the following day we'll have Kenneth Smith.
So,
Okay.
so will you give us more than 15 minutes of notification before it
I'll
happens?
get it out today. I'll get it out today. I'll send David the summary so he can post.
Yeah, but Phil, it's been every week at this time slot.
Yeah,
The sign up comes late sometimes, but yeah, it's been every week at this time slot.
That's what I figure, because I trusted it would be, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'll put
Well,
that together.
maybe I should live up to my standard. Certainty is not good.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, me too. I mean, those of us who have who have tendency to be very anxious about nothing, it's like, oh my God, where's that link? Where's that link?
No, I'm not anxious. So David, the only request I have for the link is because when I was doing my research from last week, I wanted to write Rick a note. And even though I went to your other website, I couldn't find him. So if you put up this website, then I can send him a note.
I'll get it up there.
Yeah. But I depend on you. I trust you. You're going to bring it up. I don't worry about it.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I guess I'm at that point too, finally.
That's life.
after 3 or 4 months. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed
Bye-bye.
all of you.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed all of you.
Thank you. I
Bye.
enjoyed all of you as well.
Yay.
Take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.